Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon technical conference. My name is Deepak Ramlachan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Electric Reliability here at FERC. Welcome to you all. Welcome to the panelists, audience members. I want to acknowledge the chairman and commissioners here as well. On behalf of the commission, we're pleased to welcome you all to the Wildfire Risk Mitigation Technical Conference to discuss cost-effective best practices to reduce the risk of wildfire ignition from the bulk power system. While we have convened this technical conference in response to Executive Order 14308, and the title of that executive order is Empowering Common Sense Wildfire Prevention and Response, the Commission also recognizes that the severity and incidence of wildfires has grown in recent years, with 6 of the top 10 largest wildfires occurring in the last 10 years. Fire seasons have extended from what was historically about 5 months to just about year-round now in recent years. These wildfires have been attributed to persistent drought, high temperatures, and a number of other factors. Recent wildfires have also demonstrated just how much more destructive, longer-lasting, and not to mention how quickly they spread, these wildfires have become, causing significant challenges to the reliability of the nation's bulk power system. Of note in recent years, electrical equipment has been the cause of a number of highly destructive wildfires across the country. The executive order calls for the federal government to empower state and local leaders through streamlining federal wildfire capabilities to improve their effectiveness and to promote technology-enabled strategies for wildfire response and mitigation. The executive order also directed the Commission with the Secretary of Interior, with the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Energy to look at best practices to reduce the risk of wildfire ignition from the bulk power system without increasing costs for the electric power end users. We've therefore convened this conference and have invited our colleagues from the agencies to discuss wildfire issues as well as other subject matter experts to help us think through the process for risk mitigation for wildfires. Before we begin with introductions, again, I'd like to acknowledge the chairman and commissioners for being here. As questions arise from the chairman and commissioners, we will pause, just signal me here, and I'm happy to take one of your questions. The conference is scheduled to end at 4:30 today. While this is a staff-led conference, of course, the commissioners can jump in with questions at any time. And today's agenda encompasses 2 panels. The first panel will focus on interagency coordination challenges and best practices. The second panel will focus on using technology to monitor, evaluate, and mitigate wildfire risk. We'll have a 10-minute break between the sessions. For everyone's information, this conference is open to the general public and is being webcast and transcribed. Only the commissioners, panelists, and a small number of commission staff will have the ability to speak today. So I feel a little special then. Please note, we will not discuss the specific details of any pending or contested proceedings before the Commission, and we ask that all participants refrain from doing so. If anyone engages in these kinds of discussions, our colleagues from the Office of General Counsel will interrupt the discussion and ask the speaker to move on to a different topic. I think we're probably at less risk for this tech conference and other tech conferences, but good for us all to know. To maximize the time, we'll ask panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to questions. Given the complexity of this topic and really the breadth of agencies involved and stakeholders in general, we won't be able to cover all relevant topics in the conference today, so interested parties should file additional comments on the record in docket number AD25-16 via the Commission's e-library system. With those initial matters out of the way, I will now turn to Chairman Rosner and the other commissioners for opening remarks.
How about now? Okay. Thank you, Deepak and Mark, for running the conference. It's great to see all our interagency partners as well as folks from state commissions and industry at the table here to address this issue. I'll be very brief because I got to talk a lot this morning, and now I want to let the experts at the table work on this issue. Um, when over the summer, it was an honor to receive and respond to President Trump's executive order on wildfire mitigation. Um, just want to say a few brief words about our approach. It was two-pronged. First, we asked NERC to submit back to this commission by May 2026 a comprehensive best practices guide, and also to clarify the level of compliance of using advanced technologies, and to assess the potential need for new reliability standards. And second, what we're here today to do is to hold this technical conference and use the commission as a convener, and to help lead on this issue together with our other federal agency partners to better assess what, if anything, we need to do next. And as Deepak mentioned, wildfires very obviously pose serious threats to people, property, and public spaces. They threaten the grid as well, and they're a threat to maintaining electric reliability, which is what we had talked about a lot this morning. And stating the obvious, these responsibilities are diversified. That's a nice way of saying fragmented, and it's across state and federal agencies, among utilities and system operators, and between regions and various different jurisdictions. But the meeting today is one way that we see the potential for progress here is through collaboration. And so that's through doing things like sharing best practices, getting situational awareness, understanding, and appreciation of respective and overlapping jurisdictions, using information that we get from the record that we'll develop today to establish effective requirements if they are needed. And also, particularly excited to talk about technology and leveraging new technologies and innovation in predicting, preventing, and responding to wildfire. So thank you all very much for being here today. As I mentioned before, it's staff-led, so you probably won't hear from me again, but I'm excited to listen. We use the staff-led format frequently, especially when the commission is taking on a new topic for the first time. But don't read that to mean we're not interested. I mean, you have a quorum over here, and there's great interest. And so thank you all for giving your time to this important topic. And to my colleagues, anything, please, Commissioner.
Well, I won't add very much because I am also very eager to get into this conversation, but just want to extend my gratitude as well. I appreciate all of the time that goes into the preparation for the written comments you all submitted are incredibly helpful, and appreciate the time, whether it's coming from down the street or whether it's coming from across the country. This is an incredibly important topic. I was chatting with a couple people beforehand. When it comes to reliability, understandably so, a lot of the conversation we have had over the past 18 months, 2 years, talks about large load growth in data centers, and there's a lot of challenges there. But I'm really glad that this is an issue that we're able to give a spotlight to as well, because it would be a shame for us to not put attention on the very good work that's going on in this area when it comes to wildfire mitigation and make sure that we're moving forward well. I'm very eager to be in listening mode and to be learning more. This is an area, as my colleague mentioned, where we have very different and overlapping jurisdictions, and there's very good reason for that, but it can have some challenges too. So I'm interested in learning more about what we can do to help break down barriers when it comes to different federal agencies, different states, industry working well together. So I'm also very eager for that part of the conversation to make sure that we are sharing information well, that we are being good partners with you in the areas where we can, but also I'm just very glad that PERT can be giving a forum for this important discussion today. So thank you again.
Thank you. I want to add my thank you for being here. I know some of you traveled from a faraway place just to be here, and this is a very important topic for me. I've seen the devastating fires, and this, used to be sort of a Western U.S. issue, but it's no longer a Western U.S. issue, and it's really crossing across the continent. And I'm very concerned, and I'm very glad to have this convening, this opportunity to convene people. I have learned a lot already from even the pre-filed reports, and the statements. So thank you very much for that. For example, like the PNNL's report talk about best practices, and very quickly in response to the executive order, there was already a report to help us think about, how to use advanced grid technologies to help predict and mitigate the risk of wildfires. I'm very intrigued in the science and the use of wildfire fragility curves that the report talk about, borrowed from their use in estimating probabilities of physical damages and asset failures from other types of disasters. So, there's just a lot to learn and a lot to digest. And I would say, even though we're only dedicating 3 hours to this is probably more like a 3-day type of thing that we really should talk about. And, I'm just heartened by much of the work you're doing. I know that the NARIC Wildfire Workbook also is in the pre-filed documents, and it talks about the term best practices and how we should be careful to think about this as best practice, because different areas and different contexts or even different systems might have different approaches, which makes this problem a lot more complicated. And I'll just say at this time, we just have a lot to learn from each other. And if we can just use our convening power and work with industry experts and your expertise, I think that will be really critical at this moment. And of course, we all play a significant role in this, but it's a little bit, separate, right? So for me, it would be really important to hear from you what kind of efforts FERC can play in this, and what we can do to work with states, partners, and other agencies to do better in the future. So with that, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Chairman and Commissioners. With that, we'll have the panelists introduce themselves before we jump into questions. Cliff, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. Cliff Lange, General Manager of South Texas Electric Co-op, not only representing STEC, but also our National Association, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, or NRECA.
Chair Letha Tawney from the Oregon Public Utility Commission, and just the usual disclaimer that my comments are my own, and I, of course, won't speak to any open dockets in the OPUC context. Also happy to represent the work that NARUC has been doing, the National Association of Regulated Utility Commissioners, and the workbook, as mentioned already. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Kristen. I'm the Deputy Undersecretary of Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where I oversee the U.S. Forest Service.
Good afternoon. I'm Katie Jereza, newly confirmed Assistant Secretary for Electricity at the U.S. Department of Energy.
Good afternoon. My name is Brad Shoemaker. I'm a Fuels and Post-Fire Specialist with Department of Interior's Office of Wildland Fire.
Good afternoon. It's good to be with you. I'm Branden Sudduth, Vice President of Reliability Planning and Performance Analysis at WEC.
Great. Thank you all, and thank you all again for being here. So I do have a couple of baseline questions just to get the ball rolling. It's open up to the entire panel, so anyone could feel free to jump in. So we'll start out with the current state of play, the current strategies that entities and regulatory bodies have to mitigate the risk of wildfires. Can we discuss some current best practices and successful strategies that utilities, state and federal regulators have adopted to mitigate that risk from wildfires?
I can go first. Primarily at the U.S. Department of Agriculture on Forest Service lands, we're governed by FLPMA, the Federal Land Management, by FLPMA Section 512, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act provisions. We have recently passed regulations implementing those changes in coordination with our partners at the Department of Interior. But we're taking that one step further with the President's executive order and trying to better coordinate and have consistency across jurisdictional boundaries where a lot of these electrical utility and transmission lines cross through. So it's uniform for our operators, it's uniform for our small utilities, it's uniform for co-ops and all of that. And they're sort of working with one federal land management entity versus spread across multiple jurisdictions, which can have conflicting definitions. I think through joint training, we have accomplished a lot in the best management practices in how to let operators onto our land to maintain their rights of way, expedited pathways with permitting, which is another signature initiative of the Trump administration. And we're also diving in, especially in California, where we do see a lot of electric and bulk power ignitions, and meeting with all of our electric utility operators to figure out how we can all work better together on the voluntary side, making sure no matter which side, whether you're in the right of way or just outside, we all sort of realize the dangers and are mitigating any vegetation hazards that could start these ignitions that we've all seen have been problematic.
I just wanted to speak to kind of the practical application from a utility perspective. Many utilities, if not most, do have an obligation to have a wildfire mitigation plan in place. Now, that wildfire mitigation plan may be something that's pushed in terms of state regulations or otherwise, but in many instances, it's also driven by the insurance company's demands that you do so. And so those wildfire mitigation plans can be very, very robust in that regard. So, many address vegetation management, what you need to do there, what you need to do to ensure that you don't have trees or other types of vegetation encroaching upon either your rights of way or onto your equipment in that regard. Pole inspections are another practical application. So most utilities do have regular pole inspections, in particular as it pertains to wooden poles. I know our own practice is to go out and within the course of 10 years to make sure that we've gone through and inspected all of the poles throughout our system to ensure that they are safe, that they are in good shape, such that if we were to have an event that could potentially cause that pole to fail, that we've done the best that we can to ensure that those poles are in the best shape possible. To the extent we find a pole that is suspected of rotting, for example, we go out there and we change that out, and that's common practice for all cooperatives in that regard. And I think all utilities is to get out there and actually change those poles out as those are identified. Resiliency is also something that we look at as well. Rebuilding portions of our system as necessary to not only create resiliency in the face of wildfires, but more specifically for us, we do resiliency upgrades that benefit us on not only the wildfire front, but also for the hurricane front. So that may mean going in and replacing wood poles with concrete poles or with steel poles. Or H-frame structures, for example. So these are all different elements of a mitigation plan that are oftentimes put into place in a general strategy to address the risk of wildfire and what we can do to try to mitigate that as much as possible.
If I could layer on, from the regulatory perspective, I see state commissions requiring investor-owned utilities to put forward wildfire mitigation plans. And testing those plans with independent evaluators, in some cases auditing the results. Some PUCs have that capability, some don't. And I think zooming up a bit, what we see emerging as critical foundational work is very detailed understanding of the assets in the field, a good understanding of their life cycle, their maintenance history, and then a very detailed hyperlocal understanding of the risk of failure. If a failure happened in this location, what could the consequence be? That risk of failure plus consequence help you then prioritize beyond your standard maintenance cycles and so on, where you need to focus investment, energy, time, attention first. And so we see regulators requiring and utilities deepening their detailed understanding of both the asset base and the risk on the ground. And those factors are changing very quickly. The risk on the ground, what you had thought was consequence 3 years ago, now you have more information from new fires that have happened. That gives you a new sense of where you might need to look back at the utilities assets and consider a new round of risk analysis. So this is a very rapidly changing landscape, and that process of deep data understanding followed by iterative risk analysis and consequence, understanding of potential consequence, really underpins all of the follow-on solutions that you might put in place. Additional inspections, changes in your hardware standards, changes in your standards for PSPS, and so on. It all has to be driven from that underlying data understanding and iterative risk analysis as new science comes in.
So as was mentioned earlier, wildfires are something that the West has been battling with for many, many years now. So WEC specifically has been reaching out to a lot of our utilities. We facilitate different types of forums for the sharing of best practices. We're very interested, especially in a lot of the California utilities who have been working at this for many, many years. And so we like to get them together, share advanced technologies, public safety power shutoff programs, different types of tools that are in use. We've also partnered with NERC over the last several years to put out guidelines for best practices for industry use. Our most recent update was in July of this year. We also plan to work with NERC to host a wildfire workshop in January at our offices in Salt Lake City to help respond to the FERC order directing NERC to come up with the best practices guide. So following that workshop, we'll take information that we hear here. We'll take information that we get from that workshop to develop that best practices guide prior to the May 1st deadline.
I think I can pretty succinctly sum up Interior's approach to this by echoing Undersecretary Sleeper's comments and just sort of doubling down that our work with USDA following the recent executive order puts our best foot forward in terms of producing a consistent standard that folks can plan for and actually perform operations and maintenance in sort of an easy way that puts things on the ground as quick as possible across all ownerships, which really is the big piece for us, especially at Interior where we have multiple ownerships, even just streamlining those within our own house. And then in addition, across with Department of Ag and the U.S. Forest Service is going to be a big step for us.
And I would just add to kind of reiterate what our folks are saying here. It's really looking at that constant vigilance. So really thinking about what has been said about, we look at the pre-event, during the event, and post-event. And so what can we do to have that true granular understanding of the asset management and the health, and create the plans that are needed? We just don't harden the systems, but what can we do to plan, exercise those plans, and then be able to have that enhanced situational awareness. I know that we're going to have a technology group that comes afterwards, but really being able to collect the data and share it will be essential to success, and much of that is happening now. I think the PNNL report that was referred to started with 400 utilities contributing to that, so I think it does offer an excellent summary of what's happening with the industry. But then when we look at the post-event, we can't emphasize enough the ability to look at the inspection and the what we have to do to incorporate that into evolving best practices and constantly be able to have those after-action reports. It's often that we find that when we're in the thick of it that we're really focusing on the emergency, but afterwards we've got to be ready for the next one.
Yeah, thank you all for that response. It was a good baseline for things that are happening now and a little preview of things that you expect to continue and maybe improve upon. On that note, in the theme of looking ahead, under the umbrella of coordination between all of us, really, between federal agencies and states, federal agencies and state agencies with utilities, what do you look forward to as far as enhancing that coordination? What needs to happen? We heard Commissioner Chang mention the FERC role, and interested in your thoughts on how FERC can play a role in all of this. So what needs to be enhanced as far as that coordination?
I appreciate the interest in coordination and communication. And I think for FERC and the state agencies, NARUC is an excellent place for conversation, as we're all members. But I would point to the Electric Sector Coordinating Council as a place where coordination had been going on and may continue. There would have been really solid work there, and really look forward to the federal agencies working with the electric sector through that venue, or creating sub-venues of that if necessary. Regulators often sort of listened in to the calls and workshops that the Coordinating Council created, so that we could keep abreast of the emerging issues. But that was a forum that was able to move very quickly, and I think it would be fantastic to see that sort of picked up and continued forward under this umbrella.
Thanks. So being with the Department of Energy and having the capabilities of the national labs, I have to put in a big plug for data. So there's currently no central database for ignition reporting. And I think that the models, the calculations that need to be made really will be so much more accurate and useful and actionable if we could have access and be able to share and collaborate on the data.
I'll also sort of add on to that. When we think about sort of what we're looking forward to, it's actually electric utilities being an active partner in land management with us to reduce risk. So before we get an ignition, we at the federal level are looking for better data on where the power lines are actually located, so we can do some pre-season planning and understand when an incident management team comes in where some of their vulnerabilities are, what they need to be watching out for, not just where it's burning today, but where it might burn a week or 2 weeks or even perhaps a month into the future, depending on the weather. During an actual incident, we're also looking forward to working with utilities and FERC on standards for power safety shutoffs. We currently see that it's applied very differently in different areas, and we're doing a lot of communication with the public and incorporating when we're doing preventative measures to reduce their risk. I think will be really helpful as we educate not only the public in the West, but across the nation writ large. As we've mentioned, it used to be an only Western problem, only 5 months a year. It's 12 months a year. We're seeing fires in New Jersey and different parts of the East. So more uniform standards on how we can sort of prevent some of the ignitions from power lines. And then when we think about after the fire, sort of dissecting into that 3 buckets, we really want to understand the utilities' interest in hardening standards and grid resilience once a wildfire has burned through. We've seen time and time again communities are impacted by fire and they build back in the same way. We don't want to see that same thing happen here, especially looking at sort of the delta that we're looking at in terms of power needs across the country. And so figuring out what standards for hardening, if we do have to rebuild, should something be impacted by a wildfire, we want to be an active partner with you all on that front.
Wanted to address a couple things, and I couldn't agree more. Coordination amongst the different agencies, I think, is incredibly important. As a stakeholder who I'll use for an example right now, we recently had a project where we're looking at crossing fish and wildlife lands, and had a call recently with the whole alphabet soup of different agencies, not only at the federal level, but at the state level, to figure out what we needed to do just to cross that property to provide service to the load that we were trying to get to. And so consistency, I think, is really, really good. I think coordination is going to be really, really good among the agencies in that regard to make sure that we're all on the same page. Permitting, particularly with my colleagues out in the West, I know has been an issue in the past in trying to get permits that are necessary to even just come come in and remove, danger trees that maybe are outside of their right of way or whatever the case may be. So I know that that is a huge issue as well. I do want to be careful, though, when it comes to uniform standards to a certain extent, because we need to make sure that we're not using a one-size-fits-all approach. And the reason I say that is when we look at look at Texas, for example, where I'm from, you look at the vastness of the state and you look at the differences as you move from east to west. You've got the piney woods of East Texas that require a completely different set of practices that you would use to manage and mitigate fires as compared to the areas of West Texas where you really have wide open lands, very little fuel out there to actually ignite. You don't have the tall trees that may fall into your lines, for example. And so really need to make sure that whatever we do is really something that's allowed to be tailored and fits the specific needs of the areas that you're in. And Texas being a microcosm of really the entire U.S. in that regard, our needs across the U.S. are going to vary greatly. And from a co-op perspective, even from co-op to co-op, it's going to be incredibly different as well. So my co-op's in one area of our membership they're going to be handling wildfire mitigation in a different way than some of the other co-ops are. So I think that's very, very important. So power shutoffs, I think, are a tool. Want to make sure that, from our perspective, we don't go down that road of actually mandating it unless it's absolutely necessary. That has incredible hardships on people, when they're affected and when they're subject to those. And so I think, we need to make sure we've got a tool set, but allow folks to be able to pull the right tool out of the toolbox when they need it, such that, we get effective wildfire mitigation as a result.
So I'll double down on the data comment too. As we start to look at gaps in reliability standards, I think it's really important to understand what's out there, what's happening, and what's working. And we track as close as we can the number of public safety power shutoff programs in the West and the effectiveness of those, but we just don't have a lot of data to really quantify that. And so as we look forward, once again, I just want to emphasize the importance on the data component of this. But I also want to say that this is not just a bulk power system issue. I realize the executive order specifically calls out the bulk power system, but this is a distribution system issue. This is a sub-transmission issue. This is a bulk power system issue. And I think if we're looking at a holistic solution to address reducing the risk of elements causing wildfires, we need to be able to coordinate across states at the federal level and all around to be able to really, really tackle this issue.
I have a few notes from Interior, things we wanted to highlight on this topic today. One, we'd really like to work jointly with utility companies as the sort of landowner regulator in all phases of the event, pre, during, and post. It's not just the actual incidents of the wildfire where we could be making an impact here. And in terms of consistency, we want to look at this to encourage consistent risk-based vegetation management, but also recognize those regional differences in terrain ecology and ownership, because managing something in West Texas or Nevada is very much not the same as managing in the Southeast, the Northeast, or the Pacific Northwest. I had 4 areas here of sort of the highlights that we wanted to have. Vegetation management protocol, real-time information exchange and data is certainly a big area that we wanted to highlight. Cross-training and joint exercises. I would caveat that and say I think we do a pretty good job integrating field teams and our on-the-ground personnel with that. And then risk-informed asset management, where Interior at this point, we don't necessarily have a lot of the data from utility companies to help us drive mitigation decisions on our own lands that maybe go out a little further away from the bulk power transmission. So if we need to do something a little more landscape level, sharing data would be a great way for us to do that.
If possible, could I also just clarify my comment? Sorry, Commissioner. I think Cliff brought up a good point about not having a one-size-fits-all. When we said we wanted uniform standards, basically we just want to understand in different areas of the country what tools are available for that. So I maybe misspoke when I said uniform standards, and just better understanding how utilities think about engaging that tool and when they try to do it, so we can work in concert to communicate to the concerned public, especially if we know a major weather event is coming and elevated fire danger is predicted. So completely agree that East and West Texas, East and the West of the United States, not uniform, one size fits all. It doesn't work in fire management, but just wanted to clarify that for the record.
Yes, Commissioner, please go ahead.
Do you mind if I just have a follow-up question? First of all, I just think it's incredibly valuable to have different agencies here. We at FERC just do our electricity stuff or power or energy stuff, and sometimes we don't think outside of our little box. And so I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. And given this opportunity, I was just wondering, following up on the discussion here about data and gathering information, I was just wondering, Chair Tawney, maybe you can share a bit about how the states across the West are sharing experiences and data, and where that is. And because I read that you talk about near misses. So like even events that don't happen, we might have lessons learned from those. And then to my partners in the other departments, it's really a unique opportunity to have you here. And I just wonder, when you think about additional data or additional tools or additional sort of comprehensive, centrally located database of some kind, how are you thinking about this? Would it make sense to have one of the departments be the lead, or are there cross-sectional, like what is there more than sort of like, yes, we'd love to collaborate, we'd like to get more data, like what would be our actionable next step on this? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Chang. So to Mr. Sudduth's point, there isn't consistent ignition data available. It is difficult even to find consistent data about the different wildfires, right? Because they're investigated by different agencies, they're tracked even within states by different agencies. So getting a number of utility-caused fires and acres impacted is very difficult. So it's very difficult based on that to understand the trend, other than there's a significant new number of high-profile events, right? Are we actually having more ignitions than we used to have, or are the ignitions leading to worse consequences than we used to have? We're not really sure. And so some work to capture ignitions which don't turn into wildfires, ignitions that turn into different events, and the cause codes, right? Is it equipment failure? Is it an animal? Is it vegetation? Is really important. And not all states capture that, and it can be often confidential information. So work around reporting would be helpful. But in many states, you have a liability regime that means often folks are very sensitive about cause codes and sort of releasing information early. Often it can take a long time to investigate. And this is where I think moving towards a safety culture approach, where we're capturing near misses in a way that does not punish the actor, but allows us to capture root cause analysis, understand, is there a particular component that is failing regularly? Is there a particular sort of risk that we hadn't thought about that is showing up often? And spreading those learnings across the sector very rapidly. So the the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does this, and the aviation industry does this. So we're in a situation where ignitions now are potentially extraordinarily high consequence for the first time in a century of operating the system. We need to shift our reporting structure to accommodate that in order to capture near misses, learn from them, and spread the lessons back out. Similarly, if we aren't capturing those near misses, we don't know if we're doing better. We don't know if we're actually all the mitigations we're deploying and the billions of dollars that we're spending are really making our communities safer. We think they are. It's an intuition in many cases. And so finding ways to capture that data, protect the reporter from punishment outside of egregious behavior, I think is really an important way that the sector needs to move forward to face the challenge.
Thanks for the question, Commissioner, about data and how we think about it. To my comments about accurate power line location information, we often hear security concerns about divulging where our electrical infrastructure is. And so one thing that we look forward to working with you all and the Department of Energy with is that if one of you could collectively securely store that information that could be accessed either when there is a wildfire emergency or, as my colleague from DOI mentioned, if we're going to do some of that pre-wildfire mitigation work. So there's a clear purpose and need to access the data, it's limited and bound, and that way security concerns are mitigated. And so we would be interested in some sort of role for either the Commission or perhaps DOE, who has a lot of ability to store some data like that, that we could then opt in to get on an as-needed basis to sort of mitigate those, would be something we're actively thinking about moving forward.
Okay, with that, if there's no follow-up, Commissioner, we'll move on to questions.
Thank you. It's actually a follow-up. It's really you've answered the questions. When you mentioned Katie about the data, I was thinking more on the OE like 417. You wanted ignition data, and my question was going to be: is it more for forecasting, or is it more when you have a cyber attack? Is it all hands on deck, be prepared? What kind of data were you looking for in terms of the reporting? I think you answered that. It's more really the causation, the trending, etc. That's the first question. And the second question is really what you're talking about is who, with OE4C, really DOE has that leadership. Where would that data be housed if there was no obstacle, if there was an MOU, if compliance wasn't the issue, right? But where would that be housed, and how could that, if you envision to the future, how could that be shared amongst entities?
I would be open to it being housed sort of anywhere that would give states a sense of, would create the opportunity for sound analysis. So, for example, we are learning that fast grass fires are actually potentially the most dangerous for urban conflagration risk, as opposed to timber fires. But that's an intuition based on sort of what we can see so far. We need more analysis. And so somewhere where academics and the sector can grapple with what are the trends we're seeing and which ecosystems for which kind of equipment.
Out of the PNNL effort, there was a finding that it's possible that the National Emergency Response Information System program under the U.S. Fire Administration could possibly be a place where we could put some of the public safety power shutoffs, ignitions, and utility outages. So that was an idea that they created.
Okay, thank you. And the last follow-up question is: would you envision a reporting threshold where within certain time period where you see in a fire you must report by a certain date? And I understand we're trying not to penalize or do compliance, but without really a timeline, it probably would not be as useful. So is that something that you're envisioning when you're saying we need ignition data?
Both California and Oregon PUCs have established ignition data reporting that I'm aware of. Other colleague commissions may have as well. So, for example, we require reporting within 24 hours if an event leads to X consequence, but within 30 days if it's smaller. And that lets us, at least for our investor-owned utilities in Oregon, begin to capture a picture of much smaller scale ignitions that don't become large-scale events. But we don't capture, for example, necessarily our public power entities on the same landscape.
Okay, moving on to more of the operations side of the house. Those of us that play some role in monitoring the current status of the bulk power system have become really familiar with the term you all have used several times already, the Public Safety Power Shutoff operational tool. For the panel, how effective have PSPS's programs been in reducing ignition? And are there ways to make them even more targeted, shorter in duration, and the ability to perhaps recall them when the threat no longer exists in a more expedited manner?
So I'll speak from our experience. I mean, they've definitely gotten a lot more surgical. I mean, when we first started hearing about utility usage of public safety power shutoff programs, you heard about all of the customers that were being tripped. A lot of utilities have figured out ways to segment that to be more surgical in who and when they trip. One of the challenges, though, is you typically disable automatic reclosing, and so there's a long duration when we can get some of those lines brought back into service. I'll probably go a little bit further on the question into some of the operational impacts, and I provided this in my written testimony, but in the West, just 2 years ago, at the end of 2022, there were 8 transmission operators in the West that had a public safety power shutoff program. By the end of this year, there will be 31, and out of the 55-ish transmission operators in the West, we expect that number to keep increasing. Now, from a reliability perspective, there is some concern that if you have a wide area heat wave event or some kind of a weather event coming through the West, you have a lot of entities with the potential to de-energize transmission facilities. And so I will say that to date, there's been a fantastic job by the reliability coordinators in the West, by the transmission operators, to coordinate and collaborate ahead of time to make sure that removing those lines won't have a negative impact on the operations of the bulk power system. But like I said, as we start to see more and more transmission operators who adopt these types of programs, it's definitely something that we want to keep our eyes on from a reliability perspective.
So we don't actually employ PSPS in our service territories, although I am familiar with some that potentially do. I can tell you from our own personal perspective, and similar to what Branden mentioned, turning off reclosing, appears to be a pretty effective way to mitigate fire risk in that regard. So, power shutoffs, I think, have their place, probably have their location, but uniformly applied probably isn't, very good in that regard. It does provide one more tool in the toolbox, so to speak. But I can tell you from our own experience in using the ability to turn off reclosing, in particular on our single wood pole lines that seem to be more prone to failure during specific events, it seems to be very effective in that regard. If we have a wind event, for example, and the way we trigger ours is based on looking at what the National Weather Service is indicating for any given county. Are they indicating that we've got a red flag warning on the horizon, and do we have winds above a certain threshold that may cause potential pole failures? If we hit those criteria, at that point in time, we start turning off our reclosing on our transmission lines. And I do know of some distribution co-ops that are doing it on their distribution lines as well. So again, to Branden's point, this isn't just a transmission issue, but it's also a distribution issue in that regard. But that being said, if you see an operation, at least on our system, we don't re-energize that line. We send somebody out there, and we send them out to go get eyes on it and see if we can understand why that line may have opened up. Because I think understanding that element first is going to help us determine whether it's going to be safe to put that line back into service. So we're not going to turn it back on unless we've had somebody patrol the entirety of the line. So that being said, it again goes back to the one-size-fits-all approach. We need to make sure we've got flexibility to pull the right tool out of the toolbox. We need to be very surgical in the way that we do it. We can have areas of our system, for example, where a red flag warning applies and other areas where it does not. So there's no reason for us to go and turn off reclosing on the entirety of the system as a result of that. And our members are the same way. If they see something that may require us to open up, or rather to turn off reclosing, we will do that and work with them and coordinate with them, because at the end of the day, from a co-op perspective, those folks at the end of the line are the ones that we live and work with every day. And so we want to make sure that we are doing the best for our individual communities, and having those right tools in the toolbox is what we're really all about.
I think this points to how fast the solution set is changing. So PSPS has gotten a great deal of press. It's been utilized pretty extensively. It was utilized in January in California with pretty extensive challenges in terms of even pumping refined gasoline to Nevada. So it has really extraordinary impacts on the region where it's utilized. And we've seen utilities rapidly shift towards fast trip settings, safety settings, to Mr. Lang's point. What in the NARUC Wildfire Workbook we titled PEDS, Protective Equipment Device Settings. Those are have proven in California in the data that they have to be quite useful for reducing the risk of an arc, because they you don't reclose, you have a fault, the line just goes dead, and that's it. The challenge is they don't have the sort of announcement 2 days ahead and a day ahead that a PSPS would have. You don't have the county emergency managers ready with a cooling center. You just have a circuit going down for 8 or 12 hours, and then a week later doing it again, and then 2 weeks later doing it again, right? We have fragile circuits in the system for a host of reasons, and PEDs are really disruptive from that perspective. Sectionalizing them is really critical. We've had a lot of success with that in Oregon, but we see the strategy being deployed at the distribution system level very, very rapidly on a very large scale, because what we're discovering is ignitions can turn out to be catastrophic sort of anywhere under the right conditions. So I would suggest that in addition to thinking about PSPS, the safety settings and how disruptive they are because they happen without warning are really important to pay close attention to. Additionally, the risk assessment needs to be hyper-local. So what we've learned in the West, in California and in Oregon as well, you may have a weather station that appears to be fine, and you may have analyzed your circuit and it appears to be able to withstand what's going to happen here. And weather might be significantly different further up the circuit, and you may be relatively unaware of that. Your history of outages might tell you something. If you ask your lineman who knows that system, he'll tell you, yeah, I always have trouble up that canyon. I know that canyon. But if you haven't baked that into your hyper-local risk assessment, if you don't know that asset very well, you will not deploy either PEDS or PSPS appropriately at the right risk tolerance. And so underpinning all of this has got to be an intimate knowledge of the system and the risk that's working around the system. And what we're finding in Oregon, at least, maybe it's our microclimates, sort of county level weather data is insufficient to the task. We are finding we have too much variability as events pass through a region. So this goes back to really needing to think about your capabilities and your risk assessment and being ready for adopting new practices as they emerge. PSPS is already sort of passed out, and we're in a new world, and we need to be coping with that new world.
Thank you for that. It sounds like that intimate knowledge and risk assessment of the system is a derivative of your ability to have lessons learned and use that data and information. I think we want to broach a little bit more on lessons learned, Eric.
Yeah. I do have a question about conveying lessons learned, and if I may start with Chair Tawney, because I've heard from several of you that there, after an incident, after an event, there are a lot of things that can be conveyed, but also need to be addressed in a very hyper-local circumstances. Are there ways that a utility can update its wildfire mitigation plan, or is there a checklist that needs to be addressed, or is there an approach that utilities should take? If I may start with Chair Tawney and then anyone else.
Thank you for the question. When we're thinking about a wildfire mitigation plan, I would really encourage not looking at it as a checklist, but thinking about it as a process and a set of capabilities, the way we think about maturity and cybersecurity. So this is a case where the risk is changing quickly, the solutions are changing quickly. We need organizations that can take that information in, make it make sense for their system, and then change their operational practices on the ground in the matter of a fire season. And so California's adopted a maturity model approach. Oregon has not yet, but it is something we are watching. Where you're looking to see is, does the utility have the capability to take in a new approach like safety settings and deploy it? Can they evaluate whether it will be useful or not? As for the lessons learned, I think we could learn a lot looking at the nuclear industry and the airline industry and how they have taken in near-miss information and metabolized it, done root cause analysis, and passed it back out. So we end up sort of trying to understand fire investigations from the little bits that get released. The investment community certainly prognosticates a great deal out of anything that gets sort of released in bits and pieces. And the result is we don't know, are wooden cross arms really a problem and they should be inspected twice as often? Are this kind of attachment chronically problematic and have this kind of failure structure in these circumstances? That would be enormously helpful for not having the same failure happen multiple times in multiple places. That happens informally among utilities, but not in an organized fashion. And I would look to those industries for a model for how we might do it in a more organized way.
Let me follow up on the maturity model. You mentioned that California has adopted it, Oregon has not. Is that a lesson about what are the hesitations to that? Or is that still something being learned?
We've been focused on, so the first thing we did, right, is because we're all growing in this, is require plans, then start evaluating plans, then require the data. We learned we needed to require significantly more data from our utilities. And then we've been focused on the risk spend efficiency piece. How do we understand your mitigations? The next phase, having seen California utilize the maturity model, is to come back through and think about how to apply the maturity model to the Oregon landscape. But this is really a case of dealing with the risk on the landscape in real time as each fire season comes around, while adding capabilities in our own staff, in the utilities, and in the first responder and in our partner agencies, so that we can build into more complex approaches. But I think a checklist, for example, if you'd written a checklist for PSPS, you'd have entirely missed that safety settings are now widely used. That's happened in a matter of 18 months or 2 years, 2 fire seasons. Your checklist would be out of date. And really what you need to be doing is managing your safety settings, right? It's just moving too quickly.
Thank you. Anyone else on those issues?
So I think you're asking the right question, first of all. So, should there be an opportunity to update those wildfire mitigation plans? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. And matter of fact, from Texas legislation that was passed this year that the Public Utility Commission of Texas is currently looking to implement, we not only have, an ability to update it, but actually an obligation to update it based upon what we find over time and lessons learned, things that we learn. I mentioned our process of turning off reclosing on our transmission lines, that was a lesson learned. And so that found its way into our mitigation plan. And so, that was something that we decided and developed on our own, and that met the system needs of our system. And so, again, every system is going to be different in that regard, and how you approach it's going to be different in that regard. And so, you need each of those mitigation plans to be unique because of that. That being said, I like the idea of the near misses, that Chairman Tawney was discussing. The near miss idea, I think, is incredibly important. I think what you end up seeing, though, is you're in an environment right now where people are a little bit hesitant to want to share that data because of the potential liabilities that can come along with it. So, you go grab a cookie out of the cookie jar and you get your hand slapped, you're not going to go back and get a cookie out of the cookie jar at that point, right? So I think it is incredibly important, but, we need to make sure that, it's done so in an environment where people can freely share that information without, as Chair Tawney mentioned before, without the fear of retribution, but for, something egregious having occurred. I think if you do something like that, you're going to get far more information sharing. And I think as an industry, you're able to advance and develop those mitigation programs more effectively and more efficiently and more quickly.
I think I would just add one thing, that both of the last two questions have highlighted the value of data in this conversation. In particular, our wildfire hazard modeling that we're using from a federal interagency standpoint is a combination of what's the fire behavior that we're expecting, but also what's the ignition potential. And the ignition potential is completely based off of reported ignitions. So we're missing an entire data set that would vastly improve our models if we could include essentially the near misses in there as well. All the things lined up, we just didn't quite push across that line to have a fire. We could essentially develop data that would replicate that lineman knowledge of, I go up that canyon all the time, I know all about it. We just haven't really had something that got us across the line for a data point on the map. So if we can include that, we could drastically improve our fire modeling over the course of the next 10 years, or even shorter, but certainly in the next 10.
I'll just echo my colleague Bradley that, we are trying to, both before wildfire starts, create a uniform risk map across the United States. Currently, different federal agencies assess risk in different ways. We are bridging those gaps right now. But I think bringing in our partners and our electrical utilities and our colleagues at DOE, our colleagues at the Department of War they own a massive amount of lands in the West that are sort of where we don't understand quite what the risk is there. So working together to have one sort of perception of risk, so we're all looking at sort of a common picture, states and their forest action plans and the variety of different sort of levels that they have, working through that. So that's one area of opportunity. And then at the federal level, from a wildfire response, each year we do large fire reviews. I think it's a great opportunity to highlight some of those fires that were impacted by the electrical distribution system, to sort of have a joint review with multiple agencies at the table, aside from the operational wildland firefighters, to get a better picture of that risk, to start understanding some of that ignition potential, some of those common points of failure. And it's just siloed right now, right? We're one big federal government, but we could work better together. And that's why I think we're optimistic about the future and moving forward, and the coordination that the executive order is going to provide. So sort of along the value chain, we're all working together to study and improve at the rapid pace of how technology is improving.
So just along those veins, looking forward and knowing that a lot happens at the distribution. So as we're doing what we're doing with the federal level, I'd suggest to follow on with our state partners at NAVERC and NASIO and others, so that we can continue this conversation to share what we're learning at the state and local levels.
Can I just add, the science around the fire modeling seems to be changing or advancing very quickly. We have found in Oregon, for example, that fire models are not able to backcast the fires that we have experienced. So when you take a fire that actually happened and then you try to backcast it in the model, and the model fails. And so there's the fire science frontier is moving very, very quickly. And that needs to be baked into how the utilities are then evaluating risk, right? Because if the fire risk model was, for example, focused on protecting timber resources, and actually what we're burning is suburbs, then you have your fire models are not capturing that risk. And we have a lot of industry that are really leaning in. We have academics that are leaning in. We have our lands agencies leaning in. The utilities need to have the incentive and the space to absorb those new models, take in that new risk evaluation and apply it to their system in an ongoing learning cycle, so that we can keep up with where is the risk next year, where's the risk in 5 years.
Thank you all.
Just to follow up there on the data, I feel like we're leaving something sitting out there, and that is like Eric asked about the best practices data or the near misses, and getting that, and we talked about maybe who would store it, but who would collect it? I'm looking at Branden just because NERC has its event analysis program, so there's a voluntary program. There's no penalties associated with events. It has a place, it has someone to collect it and a place to go, but where would we be collecting this near miss data? Who would be asking for it?
It is a good question, and I've been thinking that very thing as we've been sitting here. So we do have a data request that WEC issues each year, asking about things such as transmission facilities that have been affected by wildfires. We used to ask about, excuse me, about ignitions, but it would get caught up in well, it's under investigation, we'll get back to you at some point. So we weren't getting a lot of useful information from an ignition perspective. But one of the challenges that we do have is we're focused on the bulk power system. And so we end up missing a lot of the distribution level events that are happening. So, WEC might be a great place to start collecting a lot more of that information, but it would be purely voluntary at that point.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting that WEC had to do it, more so just that we were leaving it on the table and nobody was claiming it, saying, I'll get it and share it with everybody.
Okay, I'd like to transition a little bit into grid design. Branden, you can expect to be looking at you a little bit here. Assistant Secretary Jereza, maybe you can jump in as well. Looking at grid hardening practices, and that's a term that's used in a lot of different contexts and has been used for a long time. As far as wildfire mitigation and what's really working, what do you identify as those best practices? What has worked as far as the utilities?
There's a lot of good information out there, and I don't want to look like I'm promoting any one specific utility over another, but like I said earlier, we've had webinars at WEC where we've invited utilities from across the West to come in and share best practices from a system hardening perspective, as well as other kinds of technologies, detection technologies and things. And so I think that's probably where I would leave that is we've tried to identify what entities are doing, what they claim to be best practices. I probably wouldn't endorse any of them at this point, though.
I tend to agree with that. I don't think there's a best practice or even a suite of best practices that would fit. When you look at the cooperative realm, for example, co-ops cover more than 50% of the country in terms of providing service. The landmass of the country, more than 50% of it is covered by electric cooperatives who have interaction with all the agencies that you see here at the table. That being said, I think we really need to make sure that, and we appreciate that FERC's looking at this from a voluntary best practices perspective, because I think that's very important to acknowledge. You need to have the right suite of tools in your toolbox to make it work for the part of the country that you're in or the specifics of your particular system in that regard. And what fits with your community. From a cooperative perspective, like I mentioned, we have that connection to our end-use consumers. They are the ones who are footing the bill. We don't have shareholders. We don't have investors. And so we need to make sure that when we're developing what those best practices look like, it not only fits in terms of what the technology is, but it also needs to fit in terms of what the model of the organization is. So something that works for an investor-owned utility is going to look different than what works for a cooperative, is going to look different than what works for a municipality, for example. And so we need to make sure that whatever we have for those best practices really fits the communities that we're serving in that regard. It's just like power supply shutoffs. I mean, those are a tool. They're not necessarily a best practice across the board, but is yet another tool to use. So, I don't know if there is necessarily a best practice, or a silver bullet in this particular instance. You really need to look at what the characteristics are of the community and the areas that you're served to determine what those best practices are.
Okay, hearing what my fellow panelists had says, I'll just throw out some technologies that I think present some opportunities to improve. And I think that dynamic line rating has been talked about. I've been in this industry for a while, for quite some time, but it does offer the opportunity of real-time monitoring and observing what the conditions are for wind speeds and temperature and how we can adapt proactively. And so that gets to, what can we do as alternatives to public safety cutoffs. Along those lines, looking at real-time weather monitoring, advanced weather forecasting can also be of help. It's critical for looking at reducing the risk of wildfires. And, when we're looking at high winds, low humidity, high temperatures, how can that better inform what we're doing? And then the use of remote sensing. So I know some of these are advanced technologies and still in the R&D space, but I think that when we look at the state of vegetation, I know that we haven't used the biggest new technology that's coming out, and that's AI. So we know that we have workforce limitations, and it takes years and lots of crews to go out and identify dead trees. So what can we do with satellite imagery and AI to help with identifying, the growth of vegetation and what can be done about that? But also the remote sensing that I was talking about as well can be like, we don't want to have, we can use, what can we do for unexpected vegetation falls? What can we do to sense so that a line, when it falls, can de-energize before it hits the ground? So those are 3 areas that I would just offer as potential areas for technology improvements.
And I would add, so I think this is from the regulator's perspective where risk spend efficiency becomes really important. What is the best practice? What is the most cost efficient way to address the risk over time? Recognizing some of the solutions have really significant reliability impacts for customers served by that circuit. The way I think about the best practices in the question you're asking is, what are the utilities' processes to decide what to deploy on that circuit? And are those processes best in class? Have they ingested a good amount of data? Have they utilized locally enough fire risk? Have they reviewed a suite of solutions that could reduce the risk and picked the right solution for that circuit segment, for that landscape, and made the right trade-off for that piece? So I think your best practice is a set of processes, as opposed to we should use fiberglass poles and we should use tree wire and we should, I think it's more about the process, which then even can be scaled to smaller scale entities and larger scale entities, so that they can make the decision that fits best in their landscape. So I would look to best practices that are process oriented as opposed to technology oriented.
Yeah, it sounds like beyond just advanced technologies, you're looking at advancing the process to identify that direct solution. It's an excellent lead-in to our next panel on the solutions that we can look forward to and developing technologies. Before we look to wrap up, I'd like to see if there's any remaining questions from anyone. Chairman?
I'll ask a quick question. Earlier, going back on the data, I heard Undersecretary Sleeper, you mentioned lack of access to CEII information about the grid, and I just want to confirm that I heard that correctly. That you're looking for more information about bulk power system topography so that you can better mitigate and detect and respond to wildfires. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're looking for that accurate power line location data of the bulk power systems and various ways to access that. We've oftentimes we get cited with security concerns when trying to access it, both before, during, and after an incident.
So we have folks sitting at this table that might be able to help. Yeah. Okay.
I agree, Chairman. If we accomplish nothing else from this panel, it's just that very clear indication of where that nexus is, where we can help with that information.
Terrific. Well, look forward to working with you on that. I heard a number of folks mention technologies. I'm very excited to hear from the technology panel next. I think this was a very polite panel because we didn't get usually we have utility friends at the table who have no shortage of things that they want from this commission. But some of the technologies that were mentioned, dynamic line ratings and some of this remote sensing, those are things we've been thinking about and would like to just open the invitation to continue to correspond on those and make appropriate decisions on their use. So thank you very much.
I was going to follow up, Deputy Undersecretary Sleeper. I think it really, I heard you when you said something about, when structures might be affected and then they're rebuilding in the same place and the risk associated with that. And I just want to reflect that maybe 5 years ago, I had asked a transmission planner, it's like, are we considering the risk of corridors that might be at risk for wildfire? And the answer was no at that time. And I'm just wondering if, there's very little things we can do about existing infrastructure. We need to protect it. We need to, harden them. But to build new infrastructure in the future, I think it will be useful, and I'm interested in how you're thinking about this. It will be useful for our utility friends or planners to think about the risk along certain corridors so that we're not, I would say repeatedly, and lacking knowledge of this space very well, but just sort of repeatedly putting infrastructure in high risk areas. And if you have additional thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it, or anybody else on the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd also welcome my colleague from the Department of Interior. I think both agencies have data that can inform power system planning efforts. And not only planning for new areas of transmission, but also upgrading lines. We're very concerned about having larger rights of way. We've learned a lot from the past from hazard trees, both on our property and within the right of way, and incorporating that as we plan, but also looking at some of the upgrades that we know are coming based on some of the data from our colleagues at the Department of Energy. We do know corridors are going to need to get larger, and we do know we need to plan for that adaptive capacity based on sort of the energy needs that we're anticipating. And so between sort of the two public land management agencies, we have 640 million acres across the West. That is a lot, and we want to contribute to power planning efforts that go across our ownerships and sort of reduce that bureaucratic friction, both at the federal level and with our utility partners. And so I think we do have data that we could help and could sort of serve as the model for how we want to do this moving forward, because it's not if a wildfire occurs, it's when now. And it's 12 months a year. It's not just 5 months a year. And so I think there's a lot of room ripe for partnership and collaboration. And I would just say, as the Commission continues to consider these efforts, I would encourage us to bring in our colleagues at the Department of Commerce and NOAA who are working with us on advanced data needs, and also the Department of War, who also have data that we are trying to access on the civilian side that can help us with some of this real-time information that they have sort of captured through their incidental practices that we can benefit from moving forward.
Thank you very much.
Undersecretary, just we'd love to have a follow-up conversation. You know, I think I was going to do the same disclaimer and saying, look, I'm not speaking for the commission here. I know we have OGC, but I know certainly from a federal agency to another, there's definitely a lot of options, even with the CAI data, to do an MOU, et cetera. So that should not be a hurdle, and look forward to working with you to sharing that data.
Okay, with that, we are right near the end of our time here. We look forward to the second panel on advanced technologies. We thank you all for your testimony. This was very informative, and thanks again for your time. We'll take a 10-minute break and get back here at 3:07.
Congratulations.
Well, welcome back for our final panel. We're all that stands in the way of you getting to go home today, so we'll try to stay on track and on time. So in this second panel of the Wildfire Conference, we'll continue seeking best practices to reduce the risk of wildfire ignition from the bulk power system, with the main challenge being how to do this without increasing customer costs. In this discussion, we'll focus on three main topic areas, though there's likely to be some overlap from the last panel. They touched on technology at the end, so we'll sure pick up there. So the three are technological solutions, data accessibility, use, and security, and then cost recovery, and incentives. So let me adapt something a high school teacher once told me. We can't cover everything in the subject today. All we can do is get you excited about the topic, and so you'll do the hard work outside of this room. So we hope that this just is a good introduction to the ideas here, and that all of us collectively in this room and on YouTube will put our shoulder to the wheel and do the hard work that we need to do. So in that regard, I'll remind folks the docket number here is AD 25-16, so please submit your comments to that. Those in the room, you might have heard your colleagues say something and said, I want to say something about that. And it's your chance. Just because you filed written testimony today doesn't mean you can't supplement. So please do. So we're happy to have 2, maybe 3 at one point, commissioners with us, and they will be eager to ask questions, I suspect, at some point, or at least eager to listen and hear what you have to say. So we'll just go ahead and get started, but I'll ask you this. Just a reminder to turn on your mic, the red and green, that tells you the obvious. And if you would like to speak, please just tilt your card up so we can know that. Because what I'd like to have is a discussion that goes back and forth, not just you give me an answer, okay, you give me an answer, okay, you give me an answer. We should really be building, because we've got different disciplines and areas of expertise represented on this panel. We should be able to play off of one another and learn from each other that way. And so I know my name is Mark Hegerly. People can butcher that name, so I'm happy when I get to introduce myself, because then we get it right. So I'm happy to have each of you introduce yourselves as well. And Mark, since we're Mark and you're a Mark, why don't we start with you and we'll introduce ourselves down the line.
All right, great. Well, thank you. My name is Mark Quinlan. I'm Senior Vice President of Wildfire, Emergency, and Grid Operations for Pacific Gas and Electric Company.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Randy Howard. I'm the General Manager of Northern California Power Agency. I'm also here today representing the American Public Power Association, 2,000 small publicly owned utilities. I also co-chair the Wildfire Working Group of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council.
And NCPA has been coming to us on wildfires for a long time.
We have.
So thank you.
We're both kind of right in the center of where some of the stuff really took off.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you to the Commission for having us and inviting us today. My name is Kareem Al-Kafaji. I'm the Head of Business Development at Overstory. We're one of the technology providers that uses satellite remote sensing and AI to help with vegetation management and wildfire risk issues.
Hope to learn a lot from you today.
Yes, and I'm Brita Famato. I'm the president of Heimdall Power. And Heimdall Power is a grid intelligence and monitoring company. We also do DLR, so just that's what I'm here to represent, and also the Watt Coalition. And Heimdall Power is a member of Watt Coalition, which is a coalition that advocates for policy that supports the wide deployment of grid-enhancing technologies and to accelerate lower cost, energy cost, and also enable economic growth.
And you're at the right conference then.
Yep.
Good afternoon. I'm Suchetha Lakhani, and I head the North American Utilities Practice for Pano AI. Pano AI is a wildfire intelligence company that provides early detection and situational awareness for wildfire response. We do that by deploying a series or a network of 360-degree high-definition cameras that continuously monitor the landscape and use AI to detect the first signs of smoke in an area. Thank you for having me.
Right.
Good afternoon. Ali Arabnia. I am Director of Risk Management with Quanta Technology, and I'm very delighted to be here. Look forward to our panel.
Good. Well, hopefully this will be the most fun panel of the day since we're talking about new technology. So several panelists mentioned in their written comments the need for more than one form of wildfire detection systems, and you've touched on some of them. Cameras, sensors, LiDAR, satellites, and others as being part of the solution. can we start off with an understanding of how these technologies can help minimize wildfire risk and damage? How critical is each of these, and how do they work together? Why do we need all of them? Why can't we just choose one of them? And I'll just open the floor to anybody who'd like to start. Just put up your card and let me know. Nobody wants to talk about it. We're done now. Let's go home.
I can, yeah, so.
Please.
Sure, I can start, and then I'm sure everyone else has got
Exactly.
opinions on this. So I think that one of the things that we often think about at Overstory is that there is sort of this sequence when you're talking about wildfire mitigation, and they all operate sort of different time scales. So prevention, which you're often doing on the scale of sort of years to decades ahead of time, all the way through the sort of incident awareness and then sort of the recovery afterwards. And so I think there's different tools and different methodologies are effective at different points in that timeline. So things that if you're looking right around an incident, my colleagues like Pano and perhaps Heimdall have sensors that are really good at that sort of incident awareness. But when you're looking at technologies that are helping you do the sort of planning and deciding where to allocate your vegetation management resources or where to do hardening on your grid, those sorts of things are operating on different timescales, and you might need different technologies like satellite or LiDAR there. So it really is about having sort of different technologies aligned to sort of different use cases along that whole timeline. And then to steal a phrase I've heard PG&E say several times, they think about layers of protection. Oftentimes you need sort of different technologies to sort of catch things that others might not be able to catch. So there are things that you can catch with drones that you might not be able to catch with satellite, but there are trade-offs in sort of the scale and speed with which you can deploy them. So you may be able to do things that can get you a broad area view, and then you might need a different technology when you want a very hyper granular look at a particular pole, for instance.
Yeah, it would be good to go into that in detail in a bit. I know, Brita, you were about to hit your microphone before.
Yeah, so if you think again of the timeline, so for DLR, which I'm here to represent, it's really about prevention and knowing what's going on with the power lines or the transmission grid, exactly the condition of it, and which is what DLR is providing. So it's the prevention, then real-time data back to the utility so they know that conditions are ripe for fire. So if it's something going on with the high winds, dry conditions, and also the sag, which is what the DLR is showing, the sag of the line. And this can also be for over time. You can see ahead of time if a line is starting to sag more because it's been used, and maybe run hot for a long time and it's starting to sag more and more, the utility can then do preventive maintenance where they can rest the tower or they need reconductoring, but it actually will give them that warning if they use dynamic line rating. So that's really on the reducing the risk, and during, if that is an incident, it can be used to reroute power. So during but if we're talking first about preventing it, that's where DLR really can be extremely helpful and it's a very important tool along with the other technologies.
Yeah, and this commission's got a proposed rulemaking out there talking about DLRs, so we're excited about that as well. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. I want to kind of reference what Kareem had mentioned at PG&E. We look at it from, our wildfire mitigation plan is really comprised of a number of layers of protection that are designed to, combat the wildfire threat. There's not one single solution. We rely heavily on our operational mitigations, and we heard a lot about that on the last panel with public safety power shutoff and fast trip settings, which we refer to as enhanced power line safety settings, which is more than just disabling reclosing. It's also increasing the operating speed or the trip speed of the equipment to trip faster on fault conditions, which has a corresponding effect on the size and significance of the arc flash and then the spread of an ignition if one were to occur. So those are operational mitigations that we employ while we're doing the resiliency work. We heard a lot about that as well with system hardening, undergrounding, vegetation management, enhanced system inspections. What it is exciting for us is we're really starting to step into the technology aspect through continuous monitoring. So we kind of touched on that a little bit so far on this panel with DLR. And I'd like to talk a little bit about I almost look at the continuous monitoring of the technologies as layers of technology protection as well, if you think about it that way. The AI cameras, there's about 1,200 cameras in the state of California, all publicly available. We're coming up on about 700 cameras in PG&E. All of them have AI capability. And so now these cameras could zero in and triangulate on a ignition or sign of an ignition. And, very, very effective. Day or night, 24/7, could distinguish between a cloud, the marine layer, actual smoke from an ignition. So while that doesn't prevent fires or prevent ignitions, it does increase situational awareness. And it does contribute to rapid initial attack operations by the agency who has jurisdiction. And as we all know, the best way to catch a fire is when it's small, in its incipient stage, before it has an opportunity to grow and escape containment, etc. So that's just like one aspect that I wanted to kind of touch on the camera aspect. We're also looking into grid sensing devices that could detect anomalies on the system. On the distribution system primarily, we're looking to expand it to transmission, but we're starting with distribution. If we can understand anomalies that are occurring on the system and then react to those prior to the fault, prior to the outage, prior to the ignition, and force equipment out of service to make that area safe, that's what we're attempting to do. So all of these things kind of come together, and the pace of technology is increasing. And so technology that we originally deployed not too long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, is being replaced by newer, more sophisticated technology. So that's both exciting and it's also challenging because you're trying to install on the system. How do you optimize it with the existing technology? What's it going to look like? What's the landscape going to look like in technology space in 5 years? So that's, I think, a challenge that we all face.
Yeah, the challenge here is I ask a question that has so many sub-questions, I can't even keep up with the different questions when I ask, but I will ask a simple one, which is, you said 700 cameras. How much of your system does that cover, or at least how much of the fire risk portion of your system does that cover? Because I know you have a large system. So 700 sounds big, but not with 700 miles as you have.
It covers nearly 95% view shed in our high fire risk area. Okay. So if you think of our entire service area in Northern and Central California where we serve, about 50% of the landscape is in high fire threat areas, and these cameras are all, strategically placed. We've got a very varying degrees of, terrain and topology out there too. So when microclimates and different elevations, right? So we need to have cameras and weather stations. It's another big one, technology front, in the right spots to help us make informed operational decisions.
Sure. Randy?
Thank you. I think Mark captured quite a bit. I would just say that for at least NCPA, a number of the members of NCPA were embedded within almost the PG&E service territory. And I just want to point out that PG&E has been very generous in sharing their information and what they've learned. And in our sector, it doesn't matter whether you're an investor-owned utility, you're a co-op, or you're a POU, we have all been working very collaborative to share information. I think there was kind of a question of that in the last panel, but we have been sharing near misses, we have been sharing information on equipment, and we've been sharing a lot of information on new technology. Part of the ESCC was working with the Department of Energy and the CSER office on getting funding to the labs for some of the development of this new technology and then getting it deployed within the utility sector quickly so we could test it out. And then once it's tested out, it is being shared broadly within the utility sector for potential deployment. And again, utilities such as PG&E, who have been leading a number of the efforts, San Diego Gas and Electric, they have been very generous with sharing that information, especially to smaller utilities that just don't have the staff capabilities, but then to be able to access and utilize some of that knowledge set. So I just wanted to share that, at least on the technology side, the cooperation going on within the utility sector, because it doesn't matter who we are. We know if a fire is out there, it could easily cross from one territory into another territory, and it also impacts just how our customers react to our utility sector overall.
Yeah, Randy, if we had you on the last panel, how would you have answered the question about sharing near misses?
Well, again, I think there's a couple pieces to that. One is, who's responsible for the fire, if you're calling that the near miss. But there is so much other information that we capture. We were just recently on one of our transmission lines. We were doing our quarterly inspection. Guy on the ground thought he saw something up on an insulator. Ended up sending a drone up, did some really close view. There was a clip that had come loose. The determination was, after we inspected a whole bunch more, there might have been a manufacturing problem. We were able to get that out there very quickly for the potential correction. So those kinds of things, I think, are being shared as a near miss. Again, as to a fault, a cause of an ignition, one thing I will say wasn't covered well in the last panel. Ignitions from bulk power system are rare. They're really rare. Distribution, obviously, much more frequent. But regardless of what the ignition source is, our bulk power system is at risk all the time from these wildfires. And that's a big, big issue for us from a reliability, resiliency perspective of how are we protecting our bulk power system and how are we addressing that with our federal partners and agencies on some of those rights of way. Because it's not usually them being the ignition source. It's usually we're having to shut them off because there's a nearby fire with smoke and debris in the air, and we're concerned about flashover, we're concerned about the firefighting resources that need to come in and the protection of that aircraft and those personnel.
Yeah, and hopefully solutions on one side of that equation help on the other side as well.
That's correct.
Yes. Please.
Yeah, I think Mark covered a lot about the AI cameras, which is the thing that Pano AI does.
Please go deeper into
yes,
it. That's
I'm happy
what I wanted
to.
to be able to do.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. One of the things that struck me, though, is going back to the previous panel and to this discussion is about sharing information. And I think an important component of what we try to do is, at the end of the day, utilities or bulk power, et cetera, they don't respond to fires. Right? And so when you're getting this situational awareness information and you're getting this type of data, the question becomes, how do you get it to those first responders, right? How do you share that information so they can actually respond to the fire? And so one of the things that we have been doing with our cameras, in addition to sharing the information, obviously with the utilities, is sharing that information with the first responders. So whenever a utility purchases with the Pano cameras, we also simultaneously are training the first responders and fire agencies in the communities where these cameras are. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be responsible for that rapid attack and that initial rapid attack around that particular ignition. And so I think it's important to think about sharing information, not just within the utility sector itself, but to the folks that are actually responding to that fire as well.
So they have access to that public
They do.
Okay.
They do, in fact, have access. And, obviously access is an important thing where security matters. And so we do a lot around rule-based accessing. We work with our partners to make sure that it's the right folks getting the right type of information. But yes, at the end of the day, the folks who are on the ground going to be responding to these are the folks who are also getting information, getting not only access to the cameras, but with our patented triangulation technology, the location of where that actual ignition is. Because if you think about it, right now, the way folks respond to fire, it's that you have to wait for a phone call if you're a fire agency, and someone's going to tell you the fire's over there. But with this type of information, the AI is looking for the smoke, it's constantly looking for it, and when it detects, it's alerting both the first responder and the utility, and then showing them exactly where that ignition is. So you're saving time, almost up to 50%, in order to make sure that you're responding to that initial ignition very, very quickly, and of course, containing what could be a massive fire. And as you all know, minutes matter when you're responding to fire.
Please.
I just wanted to build on other panelists' comments. I would, wildfire is obviously a threat, and so we have to, treat it like a threat. And the way I see it, it's an extremely expensive problem to be solved. and technology could help to bring the cost down. Like, that's one of the primary reasons that we use technology in every single application, create efficiency, productivity, accuracy, improvement of the accuracy, and all of that. When we deal with wildfire, I would like to borrow from Donald Rumsfeld. So technology would help us to better process informations about things that we know that we do know, things that we know that we don't know, and things that we don't know that we don't know. I would want to add one other dimension to that, and that would be there are also things that we don't know that we know. One example of that is tribal communities in America. So they have been living with fire for thousands of years. And there are generational, wisdom, knowledge that they have lived with it for generations. This could help us to understand different dimension of wildfire threat and risk and create efficiency and do it in the most cost-effective and more efficient way possible. But the question is, and perhaps the challenges, and I think Mark could comment on that, how to integrate this huge amount of data that utilities have to deal with. And that comes to me to the integration of all these data and technologies, different structured and unstructured data that they have to use and create meaningful situational awareness, from sensing the information to from turning it into comprehending the information, all the way to turning it into projections, understanding, to Chairman Reisner's point earlier, that we want to move forward to something that is more predictable and more proactive. And that would help us to go toward that direction. But it takes, I think, what could help in this, to make more efficiency in that is to create a situational awareness architecture or standards that would help to bring all these data to be used effectively.
Brenda.
Just one comment also. It was just mentioned that the bulk power system is seldomly the one that's igniting the fire. With dynamic line rating, you will know exactly what was going on with the line at the time when the fire was detected. So you also know more about how it happened. If it hadn't been the transmission line, you will know that also if you have the sensors in the area where this the fire is ignited. So after one of these fires, you don't see exactly, because everything is scorched. So this will be a good way also for looking at what was the cause. Was it the transmission system? There could be a timestamp, and also given then the condition of the line, so you know for sure.
So let's press on that just a little bit on DLRs, since you circle back to it.
Yeah.
We looked at DLRs for line ratings, and line ratings only. That's what we were thinking about at the time. And some of the elements you mentioned, of course, is what forms the line rating.
Yes.
Is there other information that we gather from DLRs? And is that true of all DLR sensors, or are there specific DLR sensors that you're thinking of when you're saying for the fire detection type information?
So what I specifically talked about now was the conditions that are the ones that do have physical sensors on the line. So they will tell what the condition was of the line that at the time of the fire. So there are different types of DLRs. There's some that are software, and then the hardware software. So Heimdall Power, I can actually borrow ours because it's so small, so I can show you. I can. So it's actually mounted.
You get show and tell today?
I can.
This is great.
So so the Heimdall, yeah, exactly. So the sensor is mounted on the power line. Live lines, so it goes on no outage, and it's mounted with drones or hot stick. Comes on like a Pac-Man. As soon as it gets on there, it will start sending data back. Either now with the new technologies, we have of course cellular, but also satellite will send back the data immediately. So it will timestamp and say some of them have cameras in them, or this one does not. But also this one has a smoke detector, so it can pick up the smoke. But then the fire, and also the heat, will measure the heat, but then the fire has to be right there, right? So it's more for the prevention. But if the fire is in the area, it will pick up the smoke and send back information to the utility immediately. We smell smoke, or it's hotter, something is going on. But it's really more for the preventive this is what's going on with line, but for the timestamp I talked about, then it is what was going on with the line when the fire started, when it's detected by the cameras or other things in the area. Yeah.
Deepak, do you have a comment? Cal?
Thank you. I have a follow-up. So from the earlier panel, data was a big topic. Access to data, not having the right data, and you seem to touch on where whether it's smoke or fire, that data, that alarm is going to the utilities and a fire department at the same time. If you can walk us through it, and if so, has there been any conversations with local agency, any government partners? Because it seemed the earlier panel was really looking for something like this.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer that. So at the highest level, to sort of keep it as simple as I can, Pano mounts 2 ultra high definition cameras. I wish I had brought one. Ours are a little bit bigger than this, so it's not easy for me to carry around. But we mount these 2 ultra high definition cameras to typically cellular towers or places that have really good vantage points or view sheds. They rotate 360 degrees every minute, both of these cameras, and they are using the images, and they're constantly running our AI over those images, looking for the first signs of smoke. And as Mark mentioned, our AI has been trained on over 1 billion images, so we can tell the difference between clouds, steam, and smoke, dust from a farmer's pickup truck, you name it. And once we get that initial view of the smoke or that initial alert, we actually have, as accurate as our AI is, nothing is perfect, we have a human intelligence center that will actually verify that that is in fact smoke, and then simultaneously send the alert to the fire agency, which is where that view shed actually is, right? So the community that it's serving, as well as the utility. And then they can log into our system and they can see from a triangulated perspective where the fire actually is happening, that exact location. And for the utility, they can actually use that if they've uploaded their asset information, see how close it is to the actual asset itself. Right, so they have that information all exists for the utility and for the fire agencies simultaneously for them to understand what exactly is going on. And we're always sending those alerts out to them. Now, from a public perspective, I think communities also are interested in this information, and so utilities have the ability to create a microsite for them to share selected views for their communities if they're interested in that. But I think you have to weigh that as a utility between privacy and security concerns, and so that's why it's an option, but it's something that we take pretty seriously and think about thoughtfully and work with our utility partners.
Has there been a proof of concept? So far it's theoretical, or this has actually been in practice?
This has all actually been practiced. We work with multiple utilities across the U.S.
And have you prevented fire? I meant, have you actually?
Hundreds,
okay.
Yes. We have tons of case studies. I'm happy to share lots of them. It works, I promise. So we are happy to share case studies as well of certain fires that have happened not too long ago, and it's about containing those, right? To your question about the government, my colleague here knows far more than I do. I just manage our utilities work. But what I will say is, yes, we've had conversations because at the end of the day, this is critically important for our partners, right? Interior and elsewhere to have this type of technology. The key value, in addition, is that our cameras network to one another. So our cameras don't care if, one utility owns it and then the Department of the Interior owns the other one. They'll work together to triangulate exactly where that particular ignition takes place. So you can see a world in which you're able to scale and you're able to actually work together, public and private sector, in order to build off of that. So yes, we have been having some conversations.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. I had a follow-up for Dr. Arubnia, or anyone else could jump in, though. In our earlier panel, we heard about the limitations of models being able to backcast fires, and which seemed a little alarming right at that moment, but then I thought we have this other panel on predictive modeling coming up. Can you talk about what the future holds as far as that predictive modeling, and is that a real concern that we can't backcast fires that actually occurred?
I appreciate that question. That's a major challenge for utilities. Basically all of these decisions, from short-term operational-based risk management tools like PSPS to long-term mobilization of capital, allocation of capital, the quality of those decisions are as good as the quality of models and data that we use. So in order to maintain that or improve the quality of those models, we have a number of challenges. Challenge number one is the limitation that we are facing with regard to data. There is a new study that shows that the existing data sets that, for example, U.S. Forest Service is collecting very helpful, but they could potentially lead to suboptimal decision making, suboptimal allocation of capitals for utilities to do that, for mitigation. But on the other hand, the other challenge that I think utilities I don't want to speak for utilities. The other challenge that with regard to models exists is a similar challenge that financial industry in 2008 experienced. So among other things, one of the reasons that led to 2008 financial crisis is a misuse of models, or using a poorly understood models, or using right models for wrong purpose. And that basically started this discussion to not to create a uniform modeling structure because different applications, different companies have different needs, but to create guiding principles that would help, in that case, financial institutions, when they build their models, to follow those guiding principles from development of these models to validation of them, all the way how they are going to maintain. And backtesting is an important challenge that these wildfire models are facing with, but that is being improved, but probably there's a lot more to be done. I think that would be prudent to establish similar standards that similar to a supervisory letter that Federal Reserve issued in 2011, SR 11-7. Not exactly the same, but in principle, something that would provide guiding principles to just provide objective challenge to modeling process, quality of these models, validation of these models, and you could build the best model, and the best model over time could be outdated. So how to maintain those models and use them.
Sure, I'll just jump in and say just a plug for San Jose State has a wonderful center that has done a work on benchmarking different wildfire models. So it's definitely worth looking up their work. And while it's not my area of expertise, I think one of the things that they've found is that there's two major areas I think that have been a challenge with some of these wildfire models. One is a lot of them measure in 2 dimensions, so sort of the XY land surface. And when you start thinking about sort of some of the wildfires we've seen in the West, where you actually get a lot of atmospheric interactions and the creation of their own fire weather, that dynamic and whether that's included, I think has been one of the areas that has been highlighted as a weakness. The other is the actual fuels characterization themselves, especially as you think about urban conflagrations. I think Commissioner Tawney mentioned that earlier. A lot of the underlying wildfire models sort of historically treated that as an unburnable fuel, as that actually becomes an actual fuel source, and it's homes and buildings that are burning, and it's going burning to burning. The traditional wildfire models are not as adept at handling that. So I think there's been a lot of work on that front. I think one area where we've also focused at Overstory is thinking about, a lot of these models, if you're going to run them at the landscape scale, you need a fairly coarse fuel measurement, and that's great if you're looking at landscape scale, but it doesn't actually help you when sparks are falling, and are those sparks likely to ignite something? Is that ignition likely to spread beyond that local one into something that is going to become detectable by a camera, or is it going to become uncontainable? And so I think we've started working at trying to get very granular sort of sub-meter fuels level data to help with that very, very early sort of understanding of how likely is sparks going to create an ignition. Are those ignitions going to actually spread beyond the right of way? And so starting to look at that very granular fuels, like another area of sort of active work and active development.
Okay, Randy?
I was going to pile on there with respect to the inability to backcast. I wasn't completely tracking. So I think what you need to be able to backcast is data. So if you don't have the fuel data or a historical climatology, multi-year climatology, it's difficult to backcast. So I'm not sure what the context was, but I will agree with the comment about urban conflagration. the current spread models don't really do a good job with that, and we are working on that to try to solve for the reasons that Kareem had mentioned. Because historically, the simulations, the spread simulations, was really looking at, the wildland landscape, not, homes, and so it's completely different level of fuel there. So that's something that we're partnering with our vendors on to help solve for. But backcasting is very, very important because it helps inform what you do next. And when we get more and more data, more granular data on fuels, on health of vegetation, proximity to the asset, what's the health of the tree that by the naked eye looks perfectly fine, but really there's a problem with it and you can't tell unless there's technology that could look at this and see that, the tree may have, issues and may be at risk. Is it a strike tree, tall enough but not far enough away from the right of way to strike the facility? That's very, very important. But backcasting, to the point of backcasting, I think about our public safety power shutoff experience at PG&E in 2019 when we had the widespread power shutoffs. That was a very intense year. 9 events in 2019 affected about 2 million customers. We've backcasted looking at our new weather models, which is really how we reduce the size and scale and scope of public safety power shutoff. It was really advanced high-resolution meteorology and models to be able to go from 3-kilometer resolution to 2-kilometer resolution to 0.7 hexagonal resolution. So think about that. You just keep focusing and focusing on where the risk is, right? And you get more and more data to help inform the decision. And then you install more and more sectionalizing devices on the transmission and distribution system to be able to match up the risk polygon with the actual system. And that's how you eventually pare down and down and down. All made possible by backcasting, so that our biggest event in 2019 was nearly 1 million customers. That event in current day with current models is slightly over 300,000. So just think about that. Just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Randy?
Yeah, I think what Mark indicated is very accurate. So from an electric utility sector, many of us have years and years of data that was utilized for purposes really of load forecasting, right? We gathered all this weather data and then tried to determine what our loads were going to be in our various service territories and serve that load. And now we're starting to look at that same data from history and trying to bring it forward and put models together to look at what are then the fire risk. But I think, as Mark indicated, when you get to this micro level that we're having to look at now, we're recognizing that it's not all about the history. It's about, what's your weather this year. What was your hydrology? What was your snowpack? And what are the conditions? Because it's changing so rapidly on us that, say this year we had great hydrology or a normal hydrology, our fire risk were much lower in a lot of our areas. But that can change in 1 year. So in our wildfire mitigation plans, we certainly have to look at that every year. We're looking at the seasonal elements and trying to determine, did the risk change? Did this area, was at a lower risk previously and now it's moved to a higher just because of the conditions of the weather? So our weather forecasting tools, while they're getting much better, they're not moving quite fast enough for us as we try to insert them into other elements that we look at for our fuel characteristics. But it is quite an iterative process. I will also say that there are still many utilities across the U.S. that do not have wildfire mitigation plans, whether their states require it. Then that's different, but many states do not. So we are encouraging the Wildfire Working Group that every utility at least go through and look at that and putting one together. We also do believe it's prudent utility practice that they do look at putting a preventive power shutoff program in place, hopefully never to use, and most of them don't have risk. But if you don't have it, it's really hard to implement one just in an emergency. And so we do believe it is best practices for all utilities to consider.
Kareem?
So yeah, I'll try and be brief here, but I just wanted to connect something Randy said to your
We're here
earlier
to
question.
listen. Take your time.
Excellent. Yeah, I just wanted to connect something Randy said to your earlier question about why do we need all these different tools and technologies and why do we need a variety of them.
Yeah.
And I think he hit on an important point about the risk landscape is very dynamic. Obviously, I come from, we work a lot on vegetation. Vegetation is very dynamic. It depends on what your snowpack was, what your rainfall was, very recent conditions. So you actually have to monitor it frequently. And we talk with utilities all the time that use different remote sensing technologies, but because of the cost and the time it takes to use it, they're relying on data that's from 2019 and trying to make decisions about risk today. And so I think that you need different tools and technologies to be able to say, hey, actually, I need to repeat the scans and get closer to that continuous monitoring that Mark was talking about, where you can actually have data that's available at scale on a relevant time frame so that you can make decisions about, I think this circuit's up for trimming, we need to go do it, or it's up for inspection. Do we actually want to go spend our resources there, or is there another area that is maybe higher risk because it had abnormal growth conditions or forest dieback or some other conditions? So I think that is one of the things that sort of pushes you to have a variety of technologies to be able to actually get repeat scans on a time scale that really matters for the evolution of the risks. And then you can still dig down deeper with different technologies to go very granular in particular areas where you need to, but you can inform that by sort of broader scale, sort of repeated look at the risk profiles.
So a broad view with satellite maybe, and a narrower view with LiDAR, and then working your way down. Is that kind of what you're looking at? Or?
Yeah, I think that's one approach that we espouse, and I think a lot of utilities have found value in, is being able to get that full system view on a annual or sub-annual basis with satellite imagery, and then you can go deeper with LiDAR, with drones, other types of technologies, even determining where you want to put some of your sensing devices. You're likely not going to put those everywhere on your network all at once, so even using that sort of data about where you have landscape scale risks can help you decide these are the circuit segments where I've got lots of overhanging vegetation, or I have a high density of strike trees that all have a large amount of overstrike, or there's real pockets of forest health issues, and I'm going to start putting monitoring devices or sectionalization devices in those areas.
Yeah, it seems impossible that we'd be using satellites for vegetation management. It wasn't all that long ago LiDAR was the thing, and we watch enough spy shows, we know that you spend enough money, you can see a lot.
Yeah, LiDAR's a great tool. I mean, I think there's always going to be a place for it. I don't mean to say that, but yeah, satellite has come a long way very rapidly.
Question about the data, but before that, if you're just tuning in, your eyes are not deceiving you. There is a globe on the but I just want to say, from the commission standpoint, we're technology neutral. We're not endorsing any product here.
But if anybody wants to bring a satellite,
that's
we're
right.
glad to look at that.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the data.
Yes.
Smoke, fire, DLR, etc. Mm-hmm. Can one entity like PG leverage all of them? I'm trying to get more from the competitiveness or not sharing data. Can an entity actually leverage all the interoperability, put in the data on top of each other to make it all a unified data point for an entity?
Yeah, I'll comment on that, and I'll say that that I think is a work in progress across the industry. I know from Pano's perspective, we view this as an opportunity to work with our partners, right? So with the folks at Overstory and others, it's all about the variety of inputs, and what you'll see at certain utilities is they're looking for a single view, right? They want to understand on a daily basis or on a minute-to-minute basis where their threats are, what the priorities of those threats are, right? And so what are those various inputs? So if you talk, weather stations become incredibly important, for example, right? So how do you bring that information in? So we've partnered with Western Weather Group, and we work with them, and we bring in a lot of their information to our platform to support what they're seeing from our utility customers are seeing from a situational awareness background. So the answer is, I think the conversations to a large degree have begun. Because you're going to get an information overload, right? If you're a first responder, or if you're someone working in the operations area of a utility, and so I think the goal for the industry is recognizing that and figuring out ways to do that work together so that we can make it a unified approach for our utility customers. But I'd love to hear what the other folks have from their perspective.
Yes. So if you think of so it can all play together, the data. So there's lots of data coming back from the DLR. And yes, there are 30 some vendors out there, lots of different kinds, combining from software only to software and hardware. What it can help the utility with is really also obviously prevent, so you know that you need to do the preventive maintenance or the conditions are ripe and we know that the line is sagging. But also once the event has happened, how do you then manage during that and make sure that you don't have a lot has been said about the power, the public safety power shutoffs. And during the event, how do you know what kind of conditions the rest of the system is? And can you reroute the power during the event itself, but also during the recovery, the reconstruction, the rebuild as well? So there's all this data that can play together. There's tons of it that can help for the end user to not have as much pain at the end of the day with can limit or even eliminate some of the public safety power shutoffs, for example.
So, Chad, do you have another comment, or just anybody else want to comment on while we're on this topic, or should we go ahead and move on?
I would just say, I think Stu's right. I'd say it's a work in progress across the industry, and I think one of the things to acknowledge, which has come up in the previous panel, and I think it's come up a few times here, is there is a wide range of utilities out there, and so you have probably one of the largest, most sophisticated to my left here. They are probably doing an amazing job at being able to integrate data across, although I think even Mark would acknowledge that's probably still a work in progress there. I think when you start getting to more public power agencies, municipal cooperatives, it becomes much harder just because of the IT resources it takes. But I think they're absolutely working on it. And I think the other sometimes is important to sort of distinguish is, again, what the use case is for the data. I think there's a difference between emergency operations and sort of incident awareness and wanting to have all these data streams. All of those things may not be as relevant for your asset manager who's running a pole replacement program or your vegetation manager who's trying to plan what's my work for the year out. And so I think there is this, having to dial in, like, what data do I actually need for that job? And do I need a single pane of glass for all of that? Or is that, that's a little bit, bridge too far for many.
Just to close on that, I agree it is a work in progress. Some of the data, like the AI camera data, all of that is publicly available. A lot of the other data that we pull, though, is very specific to the utility and their assets and, the veg or whatever threats that are in proximity to the asset. So we're looking at that very closely and trying to put all of that together. One thing that I'll say is that we're doing a very good job, both for investor-owned utilities, privately owned utilities, of sharing more and sharing what's working and what is not working, or what did not work, or what is more effective, in lieu of having each individual entity go at it by themselves without a lot of information. There's plenty of data. There's plenty of information out there, and we are open to sharing, whether it's through industry conferences, through EEI, through what Randy's working on, through wildfire conferences that we host and invite the utility community to. There's and it's multi-state. It's not just the West. We're getting a lot of interest from across the nation, and quite frankly, around the world. We've got folks coming in from Australia. They've got a lot of similar characteristics, climate in Australia that we have in California, similar risks. We had a Chilean delegation come in to one of our conferences. This is really an all-in type of threat, and we need to act and move at it on an all-in basis. And the more data and the more approaches that we could share what's being effective, the better from our perspective.
How's that data sharing work with more immediate concerns? I mean, conferences and best practice sharing is wonderful. That's absolutely what we should be doing. But the last panel had some discussions about I don't hear from the utilities exactly what's happening in relative real time, so we can do something. How does that sharing occur, or does it?
I think there's opportunities to improve there. I'm not sure entirely why folks wouldn't want to share, other than what's been mentioned, some liability issues. But if we can create a framework or some form of structure where we share the data, we share the near misses, we share characteristics about events, I think it would benefit us all. We learn from every ignition. First and foremost, there's another comment or subject at the previous panel about not having a consistent manner by which operators track their ignitions. In California, it's very, very robust. We have to file with our California Public Utilities Commission on a quarterly basis and then annually how many CPUC reportable fire ignitions that we have on our system. And there's a very strict definition. An ignition that results in more than 1 linear meter caused by utility infrastructure. Whether there's an equipment failure, a wire down, a vehicle hitting a pole with wires down, avian contact with the bird that falls to the earth, and that's still a reportable ignition for us. So we have an ignition team in-house that looks at every ignition, understands all the characteristics about it, and then they do a common cause analysis for the high trending for whether it's a veg-caused ignition or equipment failure or avian or whatever, and we learn from that. And then we put in, we add additional layers of protection, or we make existing layers of protection more effective, or we come up with new ones. That's the internal. But even when we have events that occur outside of our footprint in California, or out in the greater West, or in Hawaii, or wherever the incident is, we always have a look at what were the conditions that were in play at the time, if the data is available. What were the weather conditions? What was the relative humidity? What were the wind speeds? What was this? What was that? And then we look at that and we compare, okay, our existing layers of protection would have caught that or may not have caught that, and that's another opportunity to become more robust. And when we get together as a utility community, both at the leadership level as well as at the level where we're closest to the work, the folks that are actually putting these models together and we're collaborating, there's incredible opportunity to just share, this is what we're up against, this is what worked, what wasn't effective. So if we could create something consistent with the request that was made at the previous panel about having some format of where we could all share the data, then we could all attack this problem together as a team quicker.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Randy?
I just wanted to share that the number of wildfire mitigation plans are publicly available. And when we go out and speak to various utility groups that maybe haven't yet adopted, we say, don't start fresh. Really, there's just a number of incredible examples out there that are publicly available to you to look at. And I think NERC did a great job in compiling some. I think DOE's recent report also itemized a number of them and some of the features of them. And some of them go into great detail on their technology and how they're deploying it, how they're looking at PSPS, why they're looking at PSPS. And then some do the low tech, here's what I do with my fleet of goats, and how I deploy my goats every year. To address some of the vegetation management issues for my community and how I bring the community into that process. Because the other part, we're just one stakeholder in this process, but there's a lot that can be done by our community, our homeowners, our businesses, and we have to work hard at getting them to do the right thing on their side as well. And so we utilize in some of our wildfire mitigation plans, some of the details on how they could employ more of those activities. And put those out in their bill inserts and other types of things for the community, so we have a broader set of stakeholders in this whole process. But those are the first and foremost we would recommend. Anybody who hasn't yet put one together but is thinking about it, just pull 4 or 5 of those publicly available ones that might be a utility of similar type and start with that.
Yeah, great, thanks. I did not think we'd be talking about goats today. That's a surprise. You didn't bring
it
one.
Works.
You didn't bring
I
a
didn't
goat.
bring one.
No goats. No goats. So, Ollie, you got. I was going to ask you a question, but go ahead and answer. Then I'll ask you a question. You're going to say what you're going to say.
I just want to bring to your attention the importance of metrics and all those near misses that you mentioned and information sharing. So Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Lab has formed a technical advisory team that I have been chairing that committee. They recently put together a very interesting database that brings all of these WMPs across all utilities, most utilities at least. I think the similar platform could be potentially leveraged for data sharing, perhaps with certain level of access to be granted internally. The link to that database is in my pre-filed testimony. But also on the importance of metrics, I wanted to briefly talk about it. I think one issue, if we can't measure it, we can't improve it. And near misses or events that won't happen, or to Randy's point that you could have a perfect summer or fall, nothing could happen, it doesn't mean you're doing great. Or you could have a very bad fire season, it also doesn't mean that you're not doing enough. So it's important how to address it. I think it requires more effort to build more advanced metrics such as probabilistic counterfactual risk analysis, that basically the idea is when you do so well with risk management, with reducing disasters or risk, what happens is the success goes unnoticed. When you're so successful, basically nothing will happen. And how to measure your success when nothing will happen, it requires that kind of approach and framework. And I think that would be prudent to think about it. And also, to Randy's point, the variability in data, how to address, how to build metrics that normalizes for weather changes so you could have a fair comparison from year over year or from region to region. I think that would be helpful to basically measure your progress and also build upon that. So,
yeah, so let's build on that. Who else has thought about metrics and how we measure success? Any ideas on that? Jenna?
I'm sure everyone here has thought about this quite a bit. I think earlier in the questions that you guys put out earlier, the CPUC has done a lot around metrics, right? And I think that's, candidly, it's a step in the right direction, right? I think that those are important things. But, I think effective wildfire mitigation requires, I think, a little bit more than just, counting the actual risk reduction. And, you have to do a little bit more around that, right? So tracking veg management, they're talking about grid hardening and in ignition reductions are important. But you want to actually see if your technology is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And it's really interesting that you brought up the idea of proving this counterfactual, right? So if you're Pano and we're actually containing and making these fires, we're helping support these fires staying smaller and staying more contained, how do you prove how much damage is that we've avoided, right? And so I think that becomes the question. And so some of the things that we think about is like detection to decision time. It's a mouthful. But the idea of how long it actually, from ignition to detection, how long did the utility or the first responder respond, right? So how are we getting better at that because we've got these tools in place? What kind of coverage do you have from a situational awareness perspective? What percentage of your high-risk areas are covered under some type of continuous monitoring, be it cameras or sensors, what have you? What about your coordination metrics? How well are you coordinating with your response communities, right? So these are some other metrics that you can think about. I also think, what are you avoiding, right? The financial impacts of these improvements, right? So there are certain things that you can think about. The reduction in the customer minutes that were interrupted, for example, right? So were you able to reduce that, right? So we're talking about surgical PSPSs, for example, right? So now you're going from 1 million customers to 300,000. How do you quantify that and really talk about how you've made those improvements over time? I think those become really important. I'd also ask, the decrease in suppression and containment costs. This is a part that's outside of the utility, but it's really important to think about from a community or a societal perspective. There's, a tremendous amount of money that's being spent on suppression and containment costs. But if you're able to recognize it, and identify these ignitions early on, which we do with these cameras, what is that cost that you're avoiding, right? And these are the things that you can think about. And the avoided damage to infrastructure and assets, what are those as well? So I think there's a lot of things that you can think about from a metrics perspective, but it's important as you quantify technology, is it actually doing what you want it to do? But you've got to be able to focus in on a lot of the avoided things, just as he was talking about earlier.
And it's difficult because it crosses lines. It's not just measuring normal utility data.
Yeah.
So that's hard.
Yeah.
Other thoughts on metrics?
I mean, I would just echo something I said earlier about there's a wide range of different utilities with different capabilities and resources available to them. And so I think so on the one hand, it's somewhat easy to come up with a laundry list of lots of metrics you would like to ideally measure. I think when you start asking questions of how reasonable is that for, there was a GNT cooperative on the previous panel, like, would they be able to implement it? Would they be able to actually supply those metrics? I think Mark made an interesting comment earlier. He said we have a whole ignition investigation team. Yeah. I think being able to recreate those sorts of teams just to create metrics within other utilities is going to be challenging. And so I think there's sort of what metrics do we need and how do you get them? Like what's the right floor that you could really require across a lot of them? And I think there are some of them. I think Chet started mentioning some around how much of your network are you actually monitoring? I think there are some baseline risk metrics that you can start to report out on and sort of track those over time. And I see I've kicked a hornet's nest here.
No, that's excellent. So that's what I wanted. Randy?
Yeah, just thinking about it and what we haven't discussed quite as much, but, least cost wildfire mitigation is still veg management and doing a very good job, obviously. Looking to extend rights of way and other things that we're working on from a legislative perspective. But, we're still really challenged across the West where we're doing veg management on federal lands and we can't remove what we cut. We have to leave it there on the floor of those rights of way because the Forest Service is unable to give us the ability to remove it because legislation isn't there that allows them to do that. They require us to go try to sell it to a mill or do something else with it. And it's become quite a challenge because we end up leaving fuel for a potential fire. Even though we've cut it from the sides of our rights of way, we have to leave it. And there's more and more data that's showing that's quite problematic because, again, not all ignition comes from our power lines, but that's a fuel that comes through and it's typically sitting right underneath our power lines. And so it's quite problematic for us from a resiliency and a reliability long term. So we need to get that fixed. There is legislation now pending. We hope we can get that across the finish line to address that particular issue. But we really haven't talked about either too much is the post-fire. And the post-wildfire is, what are the metrics and the activities that we could do a better job on to get restoration quickly. Because obviously outages have great cost to consumers and to our utilities. So, getting that back on quickly, working with the agencies associated with that. But in many cases now, we're still finding 3, 4, 5 years out after a wildfire that we don't have trees cut. We have 150-foot dead trees that now the bugs have come in and, basically caused a rot, and they're sitting alongside your 40-foot right-of-way. They're dead trees, and getting the ability to cut those just continues to add to our risk because we've had so many large fires, at least in the West. There's a lot of dead trees. The other issue that we're having significant concerns with is we're seeing lots of problems with our watersheds. We're seeing watersheds come down in through the rivers, into our reservoirs, into our dams, our hydro systems. We're impacting dam safety. We're impacting our ability to store water into the future. Those are some of the metrics that I think we need to work on more aggressively. And again, FERC has a role in some of that regarding the FERC licensing of our hydro systems and ensuring that we can get the permits to get out some of that silt, the debris that comes down the hills. And sometimes that's 4 to 6 years after the fire. But it's still associated directly with those fires. But again, these fires are so hot, they're burning the soil 2-3 feet down. And then you have some strong rains, and it's just coming down into our watersheds.
You mentioned dead trees along the right-of-way.
Yep.
And we haven't talked about reliability standards. Obviously, Fact 3 is a standard that applies to right-of-ways for clearances. Is there something we need to look at there as far as changing our measures of clearance?
So, some of our utilities are looking 3 or 4, 5 years out, getting the permits associated with cutting those dead trees outside of the right-of-way.
But outside of the standard.
It's outside of the
that's what I'm
right-of-way.
saying. It's not. Well, I'm saying is it part of the reliability standard compliance, or is it something outside of that?
These are typically permits with your federal land agencies.
Yeah. Okay. So, just wondering if we need to do something there. Mark, you have your card up.
Yeah. On the metric, in the testimony I had submitted, I mentioned risk-spend efficiency and benefit-cost ratio. But, I think if you look at each one of these wildfire mitigation layers of protection, you can measure each one independently. Like you can look at public safety power shutoff events and just look at, how many customers were interrupted per event on average, how long did it take to restore, how many damage cases were there found, et cetera, and we've been able to drive that way down, to 20 or 30,000 customers from, what had occurred earlier when our models weren't as sophisticated. But, weather and seasonality and the environment has a lot to do with that. You could have a quiet year, you could have a very active year. With respect to that operational mitigation, PSPS, it's really about fuel conditions and wind conditions. So if you have good fuels, good winds, you're in a good spot. But if you're out of sequence on either one of those, you could have more events and ultimately more customers impacted. But that's like the measuring an operational mitigation. What's it cost versus what's it delivering with respect to preventing fires. So we track, number of fires that are over 10 acres caused by utility infrastructure. We track the number of CPUC reportable fire ignitions that occur within the high fire risk area in absolute numbers. We track the number of those same incidents that take place on a day where the fire potential index or the conditions of the fuels is high fire danger for the day. So we're starting to slice and dice the data. Ultimately, we're looking to avoid catastrophic outcomes. I think we all have a shared interest in that. But, from our perspective and the perspective of the industry, absence of incidents isn't necessarily a reflection of reduced risk. And we have to kind of keep that in mind. It only takes one, and it could completely change the entire, all the conditions, right? And so, here's one thing that I am also concerned about that I think about frequently. The environment changes every year. Sometimes we have a lot of rain, sometimes we're in drought out in the West, but the environment is changing every day. It's not like we can just say, okay, today on, this day in October, we can take a snapshot of the environmental conditions and freeze them and then continue to work on our fire mitigation efforts to really measure our progress. When you have a changing environment and you're also evolving your wildfire mitigation plan and your techniques, how do we know if we're keeping pace? Are we keeping pace? Do we think we're keeping pace? Do we think we're ahead of it because we had a couple favorable years or we had some good results, right? What's driving that? There's no way that I know of to measure the impacts of the environment or the changes of the impacts of the environment as you can measure all the effectiveness of the spend on wildfire mitigation. That's somewhat easy to track and come up with metrics on, but trying to compare that against the landscape and the environment that we're trying to protect is a challenge. We don't have that figured out yet, and we are working on it.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, too, of the executive order here that's in front of us. It's one thing to say, let's do everything we can to minimize wildfires, but then to add to it, and let's not charge the customer anything more. That's a challenge, but that makes me wonder, too, building on what you're saying, is how do you measure the benefits, for one, and cost? Because in doing a number of these techniques that we've talked about, for instance, vegetation management, some of these apply directly to vegetation management, and maybe you lower costs there, and net, you're better off. I'm just curious as to how you see that as far as the costs and the benefits of spending on wildfire mitigation and how that benefits other maintenance and testing. When you talk about transmission line maintenance, really, and you're able to do a lot of that with these technologies.
I think technology could be the answer there to keep costs flat or reduce and just work smarter based on the capabilities. I just think about drone inspections that someone new at PG&E. Over the last year or two, we've been pivoting to more of an aerial drone type of inspection practice on transmission and in distribution across the system, as well as in the high fire threat areas. And I think about the old way of inspecting. You do a ground inspecting, or you'd climb the lattice steel tower, or you'd hover in a helicopter with binoculars, and you think about, and you'd go and inspect it 3 different ways on 3 different occasions, versus now with the drone technology and the resolution on these cameras that the drones could take pictures of. We refer to them as shot sheets. So if I'm a drone inspector, I'm going to go inspect this tower. It's this voltage. I have a shot sheet, meaning I have a prescription on specific angles, what I'm supposed to take a picture of, right, as I'm operating the drone, snap the pictures as I go. 20 pictures per distribution pole, 35 pictures for up to a 230 kV line, lattice steel tower, and up to 100 pictures for a 500 kV tower. Think about that. You could do all of that, right? And the resolution, we're talking threads on the bolt resolution. Very, very clear. Even the earlier, just comparing drone pictures from 2-3 years ago, the cameras have really, really progressed. So I see like offsets there. If I could reduce my expense on how I inspect my system through drone inspections, plus continuous monitoring, because in theory, you're continuously inspecting. There's an argument there, depending on the technology, versus the old way of doing that, right? You could
climbing
keep
towers and looking at things. Yeah.
I mean, you could massively reduce and just work smarter and reduce costs for customers. That's what we're about.
Randy?
Yeah, similar. I do believe as well on some of our inspections, some of our evaluation, we're reducing the cost and the impact to the consumers. Related to that, the other thing that we've been doing for a number of years, because in California, obviously, the number of fires we've had, we've been incorporating more of the hardening in our capital spend of new projects to begin with. So as we continue to build and replace systems, spending those additional dollars to harden it, where we're still challenged is these extreme weather events, and how quickly you modify your system or go in and do a capital project to address the potential of an extreme weather event, or how much of your system is ready for that 100-mile-an-hour wind, or, multiple days of a heat wave, well over 115 degrees. How well will your system hold up for these types of events that the system wasn't built for? And that's where we're probably the most concerned on our capital spend, for the next few years, is how to address some of these more extreme weather events. If again, all the weather events stayed stagnant and we were working on just the wildfire element, that's one thing, and we can measure that, and we can figure out ways to reduce some of the cost. Our problem is we're chasing this moving target a little bit, and we continue to evaluate our system to better handle those new events that we hadn't ever seen before.
Yeah, Brita.
Yes, so the technology, yes, that will drive down the cost for the customers, as you can have preemptive knowing about the fault detection and wind blowouts. You can avoid the shutoffs and the fires altogether and preventing it. And the technologies are really ready now and can be deployed immediately in order to already get those benefits. And DLR has been around for 3 decades. I think it's from the 1990s, right? But the technology's really changed and changing rapidly now to be able to provide all this data that can help us prevent the fires and then help during that reconstruction, the rebuild. And it can be deployed in weeks. It doesn't have to be years, right? So it's weeks these can get on, and in the areas that really need to be monitored, and that can also, even if there is no wildfire risk, will be able to provide the utility with a tool to get more power on the line, understanding exactly how much safely power they can have on how much capacity they actually have on the line. So both during the wildfire season and not, it will be they're very good technologies now out there to help with that.
Yeah, Sudduth.
Yeah, I'll just quickly piggyback on what Kareem was saying earlier around, there's not one thing for all utilities, right? I think it is important that the cost effectiveness of what utilities on the East Coast or even in the Southwest are going to do is going to be different than our West Coast peers, right? And so we have to make sure that we think about this as a continuum, not in all or nothing, right? There's going to be things that they're going to have to do more naturally where you have a higher risk than where you don't. And so you have to be thoughtful around which technologies you deploy, and you have to make sure that they're cost effective and they're giving that return back to the community as well, right? I think that's an important component is, are you investing in technologies that support your utility and obviously your operational, the work that you're doing operationally, but also how are you supporting your communities as well, and just sort of being thoughtful around that. But I agree with Kareem, like when it comes to metrics, the measurements are not going to be the same for the East as it is going to be for the West because they don't have the resources, nor should they be necessarily. Like the argument can be made, should they actually be creating these gigantic wildfire teams when the threat is relatively different than other places? So how do you manage all that from a metric perspective and a cost perspective? And I think there are certain technologies that can really support that, as Britta was saying, around lower cost, but more bang for your buck. So you're investing in the right places.
Yeah, it's much like when we talked about winterization of generators.
That's right.
The Northeast was like, that's what we always do.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about.
That's right.
Kareem?
Yeah, just one last comment. Something Mark said sort of sparked this. I think there is. I think we wholeheartedly agree that technology is one way to help manage some of these costs. If you're spending a large chunk of money, taking 5% of that to invest that in sort of the intelligence to make sure the other 95% is spent well and on the highest reliability or the highest impact endeavors is definitely worthwhile. But I think this is one area specifically thinking about, you mentioned FACT 003 and sort of vegetation inspection. I think this is one area where, perhaps the innovation at the state and on the distribution side has gotten ahead of the regulation, because I think there's at least a perception among a number of utilities that NERC or the regional entities won't accept certain types of remote inspection for their vegetation compliance. And so then they find themselves going out and doing a lot of the manual. I have to send an inspector on foot, or I have to send someone up in a helicopter to go look at it, which can be costly, time consuming, and then duplicative. And even if they are still doing other types of remote sensing, there's at least a perception that it isn't quite accepted. I think that is one thing that there is opportunity for FERC and NERC to really make some progress here and sort of clarify what qualifies as a remote inspection and what doesn't.
Do you know if they've had discussions with their regional entity or with NERC on that matter, or they're just concerned that if I go this route and spend this money, they're going to tell me no? I think it's more the latter there. I think, or when I've chatted with them retailers, and I won't name any names here, just because I want to respect confidentiality and things like that. But I think it's been more like, well, I spoke to my my auditor at Reliability First or at WEC on the phone, and they said they weren't comfortable with this, so therefore we're not going to actually press the issue in our when we file our inspection plan. Maybe there's opportunity for a demonstration.
Yeah, so I think there's
to see
just
exactly what you're seeing, because my first thought is it just seems like you're looking at it from a satellite. How can you know? But there are ways, right? And it just for the regulator and NERC and regional entities to learn about those ways and how effective it is, that would be really good to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the good thing is it's been deployed widely by a lot of utilities on non-bulk power systems as well as bulk power systems. So there definitely is demonstration data there.
Those out there that have done it, it'd be great to have a demonstration to see what you've seen. Ali, did you have another comment?
Just want to bring one
day.
last consideration to the attention of the commissioners and the team. I think unintended consequences and second-order risk are real, and I think that is worth further consideration. One example of this is some well-meaning efforts over the past couple of decades from U.S. Forest Service and other agencies to suppress fires very aggressively. There are studies that shows that they have inadvertently resulted in increased and more severe wildfires. So this is a hard problem, and sometimes and counterintuitive problem. Sometimes it could create well-meaning efforts, at sometimes could create counterproductive results, and also second-order risk, which is I think equally important. Anything we do, it creates side effects. Want to do PSPS, reliability is at this stake. If you want to do, even there is a trade-off between what we do in short term and what sort of capabilities utilities could lose in long term in order to structurally address this issue. So this was something that I just wanted to bring to your attention.
Good, thank you. Commissioner C, any last comments?
Well, I know better than to keep everybody up late at 4:30, but I just want to say thank you. This was an incredibly valuable panel. I learned a lot from there, took some good action points for things that we can look into, and really appreciate, again, all of your expertise and the time that you shared with us today.
Yeah, Commissioner Chang?
Yes, thank you very much. I learned a lot from this panel, and your devotion and your and enthusiasm in this space is really heartening. So I really appreciate it, and learning from your practices. It's been great. Thank you very much for being here.
Yes, excellent conversation. Thank you very much for participating, and as always, like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you so much. And we're closed.